My husband did not know I owned the company he worked for as CEO. He always saw me living simply. One day he invited me to a lavish dinner with his parents. I wanted to see how they would treat a supposedly poor woman. Everything was perfectly fine until they slid a thick envelope across the table. 5 minutes later, I made a single phone call that would dismantle their entire fake empire. My name is Zaria. I am 32 years old, and I am still recovering from the sheer audacity of the people I once called my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth and tried to treat you like dirt. Growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of Atlanta meant that I had to fight for everything I ever had. My neighborhood was tough, but it taught me relentless resilience. To the outside world, I was just a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who managed to scrape by. To my husband Julian and his family, I was a charity case they merely tolerated. They obsessed over status designer labels and forcing their way into the upper echelons of the Atlanta Black elite. They bragged about alumni associations, expensive galas, and exclusive country clubs. Meanwhile, I drove a beat-up 10-year-old Toyota and dressed in simple clothes from discount department stores. I spent my days running what they called a measly local charity. They had absolutely no idea that my charity was just a small passion project funded by the massive billionaire holding company I secretly founded and controlled entirely on my own. The betrayal began on a rainy Tuesday evening in the heart of Buckhead. Julian had just been promoted to Chief Executive Officer of Apex Tech. It was a massive technology firm, and the salary bump was enormous. To celebrate, his mother Vivian insisted on a family dinner at one of the most exclusive and ridiculously expensive steakhouses in the city. The moment I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, I could feel the suffocating atmosphere of wealth and pretense. Crystal chandeliers cast a dim golden glow over the white linen tables. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos moved silently across the plush carpeting. The air smelled of expensive cigars, roasted garlic, and aged beef. I found my husband and his parents seated at a prime corner booth near the wine cellar. Vivian was draped in a dark green silk dress, a massive diamond necklace resting heavily on her chest. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her lips were painted a deep crimson. My father-in-law, Richard, sat quietly next to her, sipping a glass of expensive scotch and looking at his phone. Julian sat across from them wearing a brand-new tailored suit that he had likely purchased on his new corporate credit card. When I slid into the booth next to Julian, Vivian looked me up and down. Her eyes lingered on my plain black dress and the scuffed heels I had worn to work. She did not even try to hide her look of sheer disgust. The dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. Vivian spent the first hour loudly discussing the new country club she planned to join. She talked about the other wealthy wives in her circle, the lavish vacations they took to Dubai, and the charity galas, where tickets cost $10,000 a plate. Every single topic was carefully chosen to remind me that I did not belong in their world. I simply sipped my sparkling water and offered polite nods. I knew she was putting on a show. The truth was, Vivian and Richard were drowning in debt. They leased their luxury cars and had remortgaged their ancestral home just to keep up appearances. But in their minds, they were royalty, and I was the peasant tarnishing their precious bloodline. When the waiter cleared our plates after the main course, the atmosphere at the table shifted dramatically. The polite chatter died down. Vivian wiped her mouth delicately with her linen napkin and placed it on the table. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She placed it on the table, keeping her perfectly manicured hand resting firmly on top of it. She looked at Richard, who gave a slight nod, and then she looked at Julian. Julian suddenly became very interested in the ice cubes melting in his glass of bourbon. He absolutely refused to look at me. My heart began to beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that a trap had been set right in front of me. Vivian slowly slid the envelope across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped right in front of my plate. I looked down at it, then back up at her. The silence stretched between us thick and uncomfortable. Even the ambient noise of the busy restaurant seemed to fade away. "Open it right now," Vivian commanded, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. I reached out and flipped the flap of the envelope. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills. It was a massive amount of cash. Alongside the money was a perfectly printed legal document. I pulled the document out slightly and read the bold heading. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage, a divorce decree. "There is exactly $50,000 in cash right there," Vivian said, leaning forward so that her diamond necklace caught the light of the chandelier. "Consider it a highly generous severance package from this family. You are going to take that money, you are going to sign those papers right now, and you are going to walk away quietly without causing a scene." I blinked, genuinely surprised by the sheer audacity of the move. I turned to look at Julian, expecting him to snatch the papers away and defend our marriage. We had been together for 4 years. I had supported him when he was just a low-level manager, struggling to pay his rent. But Julian just kept his eyes glued to his glass. He shifted uncomfortably in the luxurious leather booth and cleared his throat. "Julian is the chief executive officer of Apex Tech now." Vivian continued, her tone sharp and unrelenting. "He is entering a completely different world. He will be rubbing shoulders with politicians, wealthy investors, and the true elite of this city. He needs a wife who can navigate those complex circles, a high society woman who knows how to host galas, wear the right clothes, and speak to the right people. He does not need a woman who grew up in the projects, drives a beat-up piece of junk Toyota, and spends her days managing a useless local charity. You are an anchor around his neck, Zarya. You always have been, and we are finally cutting the rope." I felt a coldness wash over my entire body. It was not sorrow, it was the absolute clarity that comes when a veil is finally lifted from your eyes. I looked at Julian again. His silence was deafening. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady and calm, "is this what you truly want? Are you actually sitting here letting your mother hand me divorce papers over dessert?" Julian finally looked up. His eyes were cowardly, completely devoid of the warmth I thought I had loved. He let out a heavy sigh and leaned back against the booth, adjusting his expensive tie. "Look, Zarya," Julian muttered, his voice lacking any real conviction. "Mom is right about this. Things are changing rapidly for me. The board of directors expects a certain sophisticated image from the CEO. You and I just do not fit together anymore. You like your simple life, and I need someone who understands corporate ambition and high society expectations. I am sorry, but it is over. If you just sign the papers without a fight, I will let you keep the old Honda in the garage to help you out. Let us not make this harder than it needs to be." The sheer disrespect of his words hung heavily in the air. He was offering me a used car as a consolation prize while he prepared to live the high life on a massive CEO salary. A salary that ironically came directly from the payroll department of my own holding company. Zephyr Holdings had quietly acquired Apex Tech 8 months ago, a minor acquisition in my vast portfolio. I had intentionally kept my identity as the supreme owner hidden from the executives to evaluate their true character and leadership skills. Julian had just failed the ultimate test spectacularly. Vivian smirked, clearly mistaking my silence for devastation. She tapped her long fingernail against the table. "Take the 50,000, sweetie. It is more money than someone like you has ever seen in one place. Go buy yourself a nice little apartment in your old neighborhood and leave the corporate world to the adults." A year ago, I might have cried. I might have begged Julian to remember our wedding vows. I might have tried to desperately prove my worth to a family that was determined to misunderstand me. But tonight, there were no tears falling. There was only the cold and calculating mind of a woman who had built a billionaire empire from absolutely nothing. I smiled. It was not a sad or broken smile. It was a bright, terrifyingly calm smile that made Vivian momentarily falter in her confidence. I picked up the divorce papers and carefully placed them back into the thick envelope with the cash. I pushed the package right back across the table until it touched Vivian's empty dessert plate. "Keep it, Vivian," I said softly, standing up from the booth and smoothing out my simple black dress. "You are going to need every single penny of that $50,000 to pay for your defense lawyers very soon." Before they could even process what I had said, I turned around and walked away. I did not look back to see their shocked expressions. I strode confidently through the elegant dining room, my cheap scuffed heels sinking into the expensive carpet. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out of the restaurant and approached the valet stand. While waiting for my car, I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed a highly secure number I rarely used outside of business hours. It rang exactly twice before my senior wealth manager answered. "Good evening, Ms. Zaria," the professional voice said. "Execute Protocol Delta for Apex Tech." I commanded, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I want you to freeze every single corporate credit card expense account and discretionary fund issued to the Chief Executive Officer. I want a complete financial lockdown on his access, effective immediately." "Understood completely," the manager replied without hesitation. "Consider it done." I hung up the phone just as the valet pulled my old reliable Toyota up to the curb. I tipped him generously, got into the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel tightly. Julian thought he was getting rid of a heavy burden tonight. He had no idea he had just declared war on the very person who signed his paychecks. As I pulled out onto Peachtree Street, I felt a deep sense of freedom. The conflict had officially begun and I was holding all the cards. The drive back to the house we shared took less than 20 minutes, but my mind was already continents away. I pulled onto our quiet, manicured street in the upscale suburbs. The moment my headlights swept across the driveway, I slammed on the brakes. Piled haphazardly on the pristine front lawn were 6 black plastic trash bags. My clothes, my books, and my few personal belongings were stuffed into garbage bags like yard waste. Standing on the front porch, leaning against the brick pillars with smug expressions, were my sister-in-law, Chloe, and her husband, DeAndre. Chloe was wearing one of her ostentatious designer tracksuits, holding a glass of wine, while DeAndre smirked, tossing a set of house keys in the air. I stepped out of my Toyota. The crisp evening air suddenly felt suffocating. "Look who decided to show up!" Chloe called out, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet neighborhood. "We thought you might need some help packing, so we did you a massive favor." Julian called us from the restaurant. "You are officially out, Zaria." I walked slowly up the driveway, staring at the plastic bags. DeAndre chuckled, stepping forward to block the path to the front door. He was a man who proudly called himself a high-wealth financial advisor, but had not closed a legitimate deal in over 3 years. "Do not even think about going inside, Zaria," DeAndre said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Julian wants you gone tonight. And since his name is the only one on the deed, you are legally trespassing right now." They were so incredibly proud of themselves. They had no idea that I was the one who had insisted Julian put the house in his name to boost his fragile ego, or that I had been secretly transferring the exact amount of the mortgage payment into his checking account every single month. To them, I was just a broke squatter finally being evicted from a kingdom I never deserved. My phone vibrated in my cheap purse. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Julian. I opened it, reading the words that permanently cemented his fate. "I am sorry it had to happen this way," the message read. "Chloe and DeAndre are there to make sure you transition smoothly out of the property. If you sign the divorce papers by Friday and do not fight me on any assets, I will wire $5,000 into your account as a start-over fund. Consider it a parting gift. Do not make this ugly." I stared at the glowing screen. $5,000. He was offering me a pathetic $5,000 to quietly walk away from a man whose very livelihood depended entirely on my hidden corporate empire. He honestly believed he held all the power in the universe. He actually thought he was being generous. I looked back up at Chloe and DeAndre. They were waiting eagerly for a reaction. They wanted tears. They wanted a screaming match. They wanted me to fall to my knees and beg for access to the house so they could feel superior and powerful. "Are you going to cry?" Chloe mocked, taking a slow sip of her red wine. Take your trash bags and go back to the hood, Zaria. You never belonged with our family anyway. I looked down at the black plastic bags on the grass. Inside were cheap clothes I had bought from outlet malls to carefully maintain my cover as a struggling charity worker. There were a few paperback books and some generic shoes. Nothing in those bags represented my actual life. Nothing in those bags was worth fighting for. I slowly put my phone back into my purse. I looked DeAndre dead in the eyes, then shifted my cold gaze to Chloe. You know, Chloe, I said calmly, your wine is spilling on Julian's driveway. You should be much more careful with things that do not actually belong to you. Before she could process the insult, I turned my back on them and walked away from the house. I did not walk toward the trash bags. I walked straight past my old Toyota and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Wait! Where do you think you are going? DeAndre yelled, his smug arrogance faltering for a brief second. Take your garbage with you. Keep it, I called back over my shoulder without breaking my stride. Consider it a charity donation. I pulled my phone back out and opened a heavily encrypted application on my home screen. I pressed a single red button labeled Extraction. Within exactly 2 minutes, the quiet suburban street was violently illuminated by the piercing LED headlights of a massive, fully armored black Cadillac Escalade. It rolled silently down the street and stopped right next to me. The heavy rear door swung open, instantly held by a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored black suit and a subtle communications earpiece. Good evening, ma'am, he said, dipping his head respectfully. Chloe and DeAndre dropped their jaws. The glass of wine in Chloe's hand tilted dangerously as she stared at the imposing luxury vehicle and the professional security personnel. They had never seen anything like this in their entire lives. I stepped into the spacious leather-lined interior of the Escalade. Take me home, Marcus, I said. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the sound of DeAndre shouting my name in confusion. As the Escalade pulled away, gliding smoothly into the night, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled center console. I was officially done playing the poor, submissive wife. The drive to Midtown Atlanta took exactly 30 minutes. The Escalade bypassed the bustling city streets and slipped into a private, highly secure subterranean VIP entrance of the most exclusive residential high-rise in the entire city. A private glass elevator requiring a biometric thumbprint and retinal scan access whisked me directly to the top floor. The steel doors opened directly into my actual home. The $10 million penthouse was a breathtaking masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a panoramic view of the sparkling Atlanta skyline. The floors were imported Italian marble, and the massive walls were adorned with original contemporary art. This sprawling property was entirely owned by Zephyr Holdings, held securely under a discreet shell corporation that only my elite legal team knew about. This was where I conducted my real business. This was where I commanded my billion-dollar empire. I walked into the massive master suite and dropped my cheap purse on the custom silk bedding. I walked into my walk-in closet, which was vastly larger than the entire downstairs floor of the suburban house I had just left. Rows of pristine designer gowns, bespoke business suits, and endless displays of luxury shoes lined the brightly lit walls. I stripped off the cheap black dress I had worn to the steakhouse and slipped into a plush cashmere robe. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk in my home office and booted up my primary workstation. Multiple wide-curved monitors flickered to life, displaying real-time global stock markets, corporate acquisition targets, and the highly classified internal financial dashboards of Apex Tech. I pulled up Julian's employee profile. His arrogant, smiling corporate headshot looked back at me from the screen. With a few swift keystrokes, I elevated my administrative privileges on the network. I wanted to see exactly what was happening in his little world right now. Across town, at the very same upscale steakhouse in Buckhead, Julian was still sitting in the luxurious leather booth with his mother and father. They were celebrating their supposed victory over me. Vivian was laughing loudly, already planning how she was going to redecorate the suburban house now that I was completely out of the picture. Julian flagged down the head sommelier with a wide, intensely arrogant grin. "Bring us a bottle of the Louis Roederer Cristal," Julian commanded, waving his hand dismissively. The vintage reserve. The $5,000 bottle. Put it on my corporate tab. We have a massive future to celebrate tonight. The sommelier nodded politely and disappeared into the vast wine cellar. He returned 10 minutes later, but he was not carrying a silver ice bucket or a chilled bottle of premium champagne. He was carrying a small black leather book, and his expression was painfully apologetic. He leaned in very close to Julian, keeping his voice incredibly low to avoid making a scene in the quiet dining room. "I am terribly sorry, sir," the sommelier whispered, "but your corporate card has been aggressively declined." Julian's arrogant smile vanished instantly. "What are you talking about?" Julian hissed, his face rapidly flushing bright red. "That is a black corporate card from Apex Tech. There is absolutely no limit on that card. Run the chip again." "I did, sir," the sommelier replied, his tone remaining perfectly neutral and polite. "I ran it 3 separate times. The terminal is displaying a hard lock code. Your banking institution has frozen the account entirely." Vivian stopped laughing immediately. Richard frowned deeply, putting his expensive Scotch glass down on the table. Julian aggressively grabbed the black card from the leather book, his hands shaking slightly with embarrassment. "Fine," he muttered angrily, pulling out his personal platinum credit card from his wallet. "Just use this one." The sommelier took the personal card and walked away quickly. Exactly 2 minutes later he returned. The sommelier looked even more uncomfortable now. "Sir," the sommelier said softly, "your personal card has also been heavily declined. The bank has flagged all of your accounts for suspected severe fraudulent activity." Julian sat completely frozen in the luxurious booth. His mother stared at him in sheer horror, the color draining from her perfectly made-up face. Across the city, sitting comfortably in my $10 million penthouse, I watched the financial alert pop up brightly on my computer screen. 2 massive declined transactions. I smiled, taking a slow, refreshing sip of my water. The financial starvation had officially begun. The next morning, the bright Atlanta sun rose over the skyline, casting a brilliant glow across the marble floors of my penthouse. I sat at my massive mahogany desk, my fingers flying across the glowing keyboard. I had barely slept, not out of sadness or grief, but from the sheer adrenaline of watching my trap slowly snap shut. I was logged into the master administrative dashboard of Apex Tech, monitoring every single keystroke Julian made from his sleek new Chief Executive Officer corner office. Julian was furious. Through the internal communication logs, I could see he had spent his entire morning screaming at the corporate banking representatives. He genuinely believed the declined credit cards at the steakhouse were just a humiliating banking error. His fragile ego had been deeply bruised in front of his parents, and men, like Julian, always needed to punish someone else when they felt small. Since he could not reach me at our suburban house, he decided to attack the only support system he thought I had left. A bright red notification popped up on my screen. It was an executive override from the procurement department. Julian had just bypassed the standard 30-day review protocol to unilaterally terminate a massive software vendor contract. I opened the file and felt a sharp, cold spike of anger. The contract belonged to Lumina Solutions. That was the boutique cybersecurity firm owned by my best friend Maya. Maya and I had grown up together in the same working-class neighborhood. She had built her company from the ground up, and the Apex Tech contract was her biggest account. It was worth over $1.2 million annually. Julian was intentionally trying to bankrupt my best friend. He knew Maya would take me in if I were homeless, so he wanted to make sure she was too financially ruined to help me. It was a vile, calculated move designed to isolate me completely. My private cell phone rang instantly. It was Maya. I answered the call, hearing the sheer panic in her voice before I even said hello. "Zarya, what is going on?" Maya asked, her breath catching in her throat. "I just received a termination notice from Apex Tech. It was signed directly by Julian. The email says we are in breach of performance standards, which is a complete lie. This contract is 40% of my quarterly revenue. I have payroll next week. If he cancels this, I might have to lay off half my engineering team." I leaned back in my plush leather chair, my eyes fixed on Julian's digital signature glowing on my monitor. "Breathe, Maya," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and steady. Do not panic. You are not going to lay off a single person. Julian is throwing a temper tantrum because I walked out on him last night. He thinks he can use his new title to starve me out and hurt anyone who cares about me. But Zarya, he is the CEO now. Maya protested, her voice trembling slightly. He has the legal authority to void vendor agreements. My lawyers cannot fight a corporation the size of Apex Tech. We simply do not have the capital for a protracted legal battle. He is a CEO who works for me, I corrected her gently. Listen to me very carefully, Maya. You are going to draft a polite acknowledgement of the termination. Do not argue with him. Let him think he has won. Within the next hour, you are going to receive an exclusive vendor acquisition contract from a company called Zephyr Holdings. We are migrating our entire global database architecture, and we need an elite cybersecurity firm to handle the transition. The contract is worth $4 million a year. You are getting a massive upgrade. Maya was dead silent on the other end of the line. Wait, she finally whispered. Zephyr Holdings. Zarya. That is the anonymous billionaire conglomerate that just bought out Apex Tech last year. How on earth do you have the power to secure a contract with them? Because I own Zephyr Holdings, Maya, I replied simply. I am the sole founder and the majority shareholder. Maya gasped loudly, the realization hitting her like a freight train. She had known me my entire life, yet I had kept this secret even from her to protect my identity. She started to laugh, a sound of pure relief and absolute shock. Zarya. You are terrifying, she managed to say. I will wait for the contract. Send Julian my regards. I ended the call with a satisfied smile. Julian thought he was cutting off my lifeline, but he had just freed my best friend from dealing with his toxic management style. But Julian was not acting alone. He was a coward, and cowards always needed someone else to do their dirty work. Right on cue, the secure intercom on my desk buzzed. It was the private concierge from my penthouse suite. Miss Zarya, the concierge said politely. A legal courier just dropped off a highly urgent package for you. We ran it through the security scanners and it is cleared. Shall I send it up in the private elevator? Send it up, I replied. 2 minutes later, the polished steel doors of my private elevator opened, and I retrieved a thick, heavily sealed legal binder. I carried it back to my desk and sliced open the envelope. The heavy cardstock letterhead practically screamed old money and corporate aggression. It read, Vanguard and Hayes Attorneys at Law. It was one of the most ruthless and expensive family law firms in the state of Georgia. I flipped to the signature page of the threatening cease and desist letter attached to the front. It was signed by Simone Hayes. Simone was a junior partner at the firm, but more importantly, she was the goddaughter of Vivian's wealthiest friend. Simone was everything Vivian wanted in a daughter-in-law. She was a third-generation lawyer, a prominent member of elite social clubs, and notoriously vicious. For the past 6 months, she had been serving as Julian's personal mistress. They thought they were being incredibly discreet, meeting at expensive downtown hotels and charging the rooms to Julian's corporate expense accounts. They had no idea that my internal auditing team flagged every single transaction and forwarded the security camera footage directly to my encrypted server. Simone was the high society woman Vivian had chosen to replace me. I read through the legal threat. It was a masterpiece of corporate bullying. Simone demanded that I sign the zero-asset divorce decree immediately. If I refused, she threatened to file emergency injunctions to freeze my personal bank accounts, drag me through years of humiliating public litigation, and force me to pay all of Julian's attorney fees. She used heavy legal jargon to assert that because I had no verifiable income and drove a cheap car, I was legally considered a financial parasite who contributed absolutely nothing to the marriage. Suddenly, my cell phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but the caller ID indicated it was coming from a high-end commercial district in Buckhead. I pressed answer and put the call on speakerphone. Am I speaking to Zarya? A sharp, incredibly condescending woman's voice asked. This is she, I replied, keeping my tone mild and submissive. This is Simone Hayes. I assume you have received my courier package by now. I wanted to call and explain the reality of your situation, just in case the legal terminology was too difficult for you to comprehend. I understand it perfectly, Simone. I said softly. You want me to walk away with nothing. I want you to walk away with exactly what you brought into Julian's life, which is absolutely nothing. Simone snapped back, her arrogance dripping from every single syllable. You need to understand who you are dealing with. Julian is a highly respected chief executive officer. I am a partner at a top-tier law firm. We are the future of this city's elite class. You are a low-level charity worker who got lucky for a few years. Do not make the mistake of thinking you can fight us. If you do not sign those papers by Friday, I will personally make sure you are tied up in court until you are completely bankrupt. I remained silent for a moment, letting her bask in her own inflated sense of superiority. You sound very confident, Simone. I have every reason to be confident, she laughed coldly. I am sitting in my corner office on the 40th floor of the Sovereign Tower. It is the most prestigious and expensive commercial real estate building in Atlanta. The people in this building run the economy. People like you sweep the floors. Sign the papers, Zaria. Take the $5,000 Julian generously offered you and disappear. It is the best deal you are ever going to get. Simone hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. The dial tone echoed loudly in my quiet office. I looked at the glowing screens of my command center. Simone thought she had just delivered a fatal blow. She believed her expensive corner office and her fancy law degree made her an untouchable god in the corporate world. She had just made the biggest mistake of her entire career. She had given me a target. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my director of commercial acquisitions. He answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Miss Zaria," he said crisply. "Good morning, David," I replied, my eyes locking onto the skyline view outside my window, pinpointing the exact location of the Sovereign Tower in the distance. "I need you to initiate a hostile real estate buyout. I want Zephyr Holdings to purchase the Sovereign Tower in Buckhead. Offer the current ownership group 20% above market value for an expedited all-cash closing by the end of the business day. 20% above market." David repeated, his keyboard clicking rapidly in the background. "That is an aggressive move. Consider it done. Are there any specific management directives once we acquire the property?" "Yes," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "Look up the commercial lease agreement for the law firm of Vanguard and Hayes. They currently occupy the 40th floor. The moment the ink is dry on our purchase agreement, I want you to execute the landlord override clause. Triple their monthly rent immediately. And David, make sure the new lease enforcement notices are delivered directly to the desk of Simone Hayes. Let us see how long she can afford to sit in her prestigious corner office when she is paying my mortgage." I ended the call with David and closed my laptop with a satisfying click. The trap for Simone was set, but I knew I could not simply rely on civil lawsuits and real estate acquisitions to dismantle this family. I needed undeniable hard evidence of their corruption. I needed them to cross the line from being terrible people into becoming actual federal criminals. Fortunately for me, my in-laws were driven by a toxic combination of massive egos and severe financial illiteracy. They were about to hand me the exact weapons I needed to destroy them. By Saturday evening, Vivian had transformed her delusions of grandeur into reality by hosting a massive, incredibly lavish celebration for Julian. She had rented out the grand ballroom at the Piedmont Estates Country Club, an exclusive, incredibly expensive venue in the heart of Buckhead. She had invited hundreds of guests, including influential local politicians, minor celebrities, and senior executives from Apex Tech. Vivian wanted the entire Black elite of Atlanta to see her son as the new king of the corporate world. She wanted everyone to know her family had finally arrived at the top of the social ladder. Getting into the highly secure invitation-only event was ridiculously easy for me. As the ultimate owner of the holding company that commanded Apex Tech, I simply had my security director issue a blank VIP, all-access pass registered under the name of a silent board member. I chose a stunning understated navy blue silk gown from my closet. It was a custom piece that screamed quiet luxury. It had no flashy logos, no obnoxious diamonds, and nothing that Vivian or Chloe would ever recognize as expensive. To their untrained eyes, heavily blinded by flashy brand names, I would look completely ordinary. I arrived at the country club just after 8 o'clock. The grand ballroom was a chaotic display of new money trying desperately to look like old money. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a bright light over a gigantic ice sculpture carved into the shape of Julian's initials. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with expensive caviar and premium champagne. The room was deafeningly loud with the sound of forced laughter and aggressive networking. I slipped through the heavy oak doors and blended effortlessly into the crowded room. I kept my head down, taking a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, and moved toward the dimly lit perimeter of the ballroom. From the shadows, I watched my soon-to-be ex-husband's family put on the performance of a lifetime. Vivian was holding court near the ice sculpture, loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about Julian's genius business strategies. Chloe was strutting around the room, aggressively showing off a thick diamond bracelet that she had undoubtedly bought on credit. And Julian was standing near the center of the room, looking incredibly uncomfortable in his tailored tuxedo, completely unaware that his own mother was treating him like a shiny trophy. But it was DeAndre who caught my attention. The so-called financial advisor was pacing nervously near the heavy velvet curtains that led to the outdoor smoking balcony. He was sweating profusely frequently, checking his expensive watch, and looking around the room with wild, desperate eyes. DeAndre was a man drowning in debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. I knew he was looking for an opportunity to exploit Julian's new position. I watched as DeAndre finally caught Julian's arm and aggressively pulled him away from a conversation with an Apex Tech vice president. DeAndre dragged Julian through the velvet curtains and out onto the dark, secluded balcony. I moved silently along the wall, slipping behind the thick curtains, just inches away from the heavy glass balcony doors. I pulled my cell phone from my clutch, opened the encrypted voice recording application, and pressed the bright red button. The night air was quiet, and their voices carried perfectly through the slight crack in the glass door. "Julian, you have to listen to me," DeAndre was saying, his voice thick with panic and false confidence. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime. You are the chief executive officer now. You control the discretionary vendor budget. You do not have to answer to those middle management losers anymore." Julian sounded deeply stressed. "DeAndre, I cannot just sign a vendor contract without running it through the procurement department. The board of directors is going to want to see a full audit of any new partnerships. What exactly is this company you want me to hire?" "It is called Onyx Consulting Group," DeAndre replied quickly. "It is an elite, highly specialized corporate strategy firm. They handle executive transition optimization. I have already drafted the initial vendor agreement. All you have to do is sign the bottom line and authorize a $2 million advance payment for the first quarter." "A $2 million advance?" Julian hissed, his voice rising in panic. "Are you insane? I cannot authorize a $2 million wire transfer to a company I have never even heard of. Where are they even located?" "They are incorporated in Delaware," DeAndre said smoothly, using the exact terminology con artists always use to sound legitimate. "Julian, listen to me. Onyx Consulting is my company. It is a shell corporation I set up last month. You wire the $2 million to the Onyx account in Delaware. I take a 20% management fee to clear my immediate debts, and I funnel the rest of the money directly back into a private offshore account in your name. It is entirely untraceable. We are keeping the corporate money inside the family." I held my breath, keeping my phone perfectly steady. DeAndre was not just pitching a bad business deal. He was pitching massive, undeniable corporate embezzlement. "If we get caught, that is federal prison," DeAndre Julian argued, though his voice was already wavering. He was a weak man, and his greed was rapidly overpowering his fear. "We will not get caught," DeAndre insisted, aggressively grabbing Julian by the shoulders. "You are the CEO. You authorized the payment under the Executive Emergency Fund. By the time the annual audit happens next year, we will have falsified enough consulting reports to make Onyx look entirely legitimate. Come on, Julian. You are wearing a $5,000 tuxedo, but your personal credit cards are bouncing. I know you need cash right now to keep Simone happy. Do not be a coward. Act like the king you are." There was a long, heavy silence on the balcony. I could practically hear the remaining shreds of Julian's integrity dissolving into the cool night air. "Fine. Julian finally whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Bring the vendor paperwork to my office on Monday morning. I will sign the authorization and push the wire transfer through procurement. But if anyone asks questions, you take the fall." DeAndre laughed loudly, slapping Julian hard on the back. "That is my brother. Welcome to the big leagues, Julian. We are going to rule this city." I tapped the screen of my phone, stopping the recording and instantly uploading the pristine audio file directly to the secure servers at Zephyr Holdings. My heart was pounding with a cold, terrifying sense of absolute victory. Julian had just agreed to commit a massive federal felony to steal $2 million from my company. The trap was no longer just a legal threat, it was a guaranteed prison sentence. I turned around to slip away from the curtains, but my path was suddenly blocked. Standing directly in front of me, her eyes blazing with furious recognition, was Simone. She was wearing a stunning, skin-tight crimson dress, clutching a glass of dark red wine. Her perfectly styled hair cascaded over her shoulders, but her face was twisted into an ugly, condescending sneer. She looked me up and down, taking in my understated navy gown, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "What in the world are you doing here, Zarya?" Simone demanded, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of a few nearby guests. "Did you seriously sneak into a private country club just to stalk the man who is leaving you?" I looked at her calmly, slipping my phone back into my clutch. "I am just enjoying the architecture, Simone. It is a very educational evening." "Educational," Simone mocked, stepping dangerously close to me. "You really do not understand how the real world works, do you? You think you can crash a billionaire's club in a cheap, unbranded dress and somehow win your husband back? You lack the basic business acumen to even exist in a room like this. Julian is signing million-dollar deals. He is surrounded by power. You are just a pathetic little charity worker who refuses to accept that she has been completely replaced." Before I could even formulate a response, Simone intentionally tilted her wrist. A heavy splash of dark red wine cascaded out of her crystal glass, landing squarely on the front of my silk navy gown. The dark liquid soaked quickly into the expensive fabric, leaving a massive, highly visible stain across my chest. "Oh my goodness," Simone gasped with fake, exaggerated shock. "I am so incredibly sorry. I guess I just did not see you standing there. You really should go home, Zarya. You look like an absolute mess. You do not belong here, and you certainly cannot afford the dry cleaning bill." A few of the surrounding guests chuckled, whispering behind their hands. Simone smiled triumphantly, convinced she had just humiliated me in front of the exact high society crowd I supposedly feared. She expected me to cry, to yell, or to run out of the ballroom in shame. Instead, I looked down at the dark wine stain on my dress, and then I looked back up at her perfectly smug face. A genuine, terrifyingly bright smile spread across my lips. "You are absolutely right, Simone," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of anger. "I do not belong here. And do not worry about the dress. It was worth every single drop." I turned around and walked away from her, my head held high, leaving Simone staring at my back with a sudden, deeply unsettling look of confusion on her face. She had ruined a dress, but my phone was heavy with the federal evidence that was going to destroy her entire life. She could have her petty little wine spill. I was going to take everything else. The morning after the chaotic country club celebration, I woke up feeling an unprecedented level of sharp, terrifying clarity. I poured myself a steaming cup of dark roast coffee and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking out over the sprawling, sunlit city of Atlanta. Down there in the affluent suburbs, Julian and his deeply toxic family were aggressively plotting their glorious rise to power. They were completely blind to the fact that I had already severed the financial parachutes they relied on to survive. My extensive surveillance of DeAndre revealed that his massive shell company scheme had one critical, potentially fatal flaw. To successfully pass the initial vendor compliance checks at Apex Tech, Onyx Consulting desperately needed to show a legitimate operational history. It required a registered commercial address in a premium business district, a functioning corporate bank account with substantial reserves, and initial capital to effectively mask the upcoming fraudulent wire transfers. DeAndre was completely broke. His expensive suits and luxury cars were all heavily financed. He needed seed money immediately, and he needed it from a source that would not ask any difficult questions. By Sunday afternoon, my encrypted audio surveillance system captured DeAndre making his aggressive move. He drove his leased vehicle to Vivian and Richard's sprawling suburban home, a property that had been in Richard's family for 3 generations. It was the only tangible asset the family actually possessed. DeAndre sat his in-laws down in their formal living room surrounded by Vivian's ridiculously expensive antique furniture and launched into the most dangerous sales pitch of his pathetic career. He confidently told them that Julian had quietly secured an exclusive, highly classified government contract through his new executive position at Apex Tech. DeAndre claimed he had rapidly established a private consulting firm to manage the massive overflow of corporate capital, and he passionately argued that they needed to keep the impending millions strictly within the family. He boldly promised them a guaranteed 300% return on their investment within exactly 90 days. All they had to do, he explained smoothly, was provide the initial bridge loan to finalize the federal regulatory paperwork. Vivian and Richard were entirely blinded by their own insatiable greed. They had spent decades desperately trying to keep up with the real generational wealth of the Atlanta elite. They constantly leased cars they could not truly afford, bought designer clothes on high-interest credit cards, and hosted lavish parties to maintain an exhausting illusion of superiority. The promise of millions of dollars in untraceable cash was an intoxicating drug they simply could not resist. When Richard hesitated slightly quietly, admitting they did not have any liquid assets available to invest, DeAndre seamlessly presented the ultimate trap. He slid a thick stack of aggressive lending documents across the glass coffee table. It was a predatory, exceptionally high-interest remortgage application for their ancestral home. DeAndre masterfully convinced them that the mortgage was merely a temporary bureaucratic formality. Vivian eagerly grabbed the pen and signed her name on the dotted line, her mind already aggressively spending the imaginary millions on exclusive country club memberships and lavish European vacations. Richard quickly followed suit, willingly signing away the very roof over their heads to fund a phantom corporation. Monday morning arrived with a tense electric energy that vibrated through my entire command center. I sat at my massive mahogany desk in the penthouse, my highly secure monitors displaying the live internal network activity of the Apex Tech Executive Suite. At precisely 9 o'clock, the digital corporate calendar showed that Julian had scheduled a private off-the-books meeting with DeAndre. Through the discreet security camera embedded in the corporate laptop I had personally authorized for the chief executive officer, I watched the final nail being driven directly into Julian's coffin. DeAndre walked into the massive corner office dressed in a sharp-tailored suit carrying a sleek leather portfolio. He looked every bit the successful corporate financial advisor, completely hiding the desperate, morally bankrupt con artist lurking underneath. He confidently placed the fraudulent vendor contract for Onyx Consulting squarely on Julian's massive desk. Julian looked incredibly nervous, the heavy weight of his impending crime clearly visible on his face. His hands shook slightly as he picked up his expensive silver pen. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. This was not a rookie business mistake or a simple administrative oversight. He was actively and consciously choosing to embezzle $2 million from a publicly traded corporate entity. He stared at the signature line for a very long time. I could clearly see the intense internal battle playing out behind his eyes. The rational fear of federal prison was fighting a losing battle against his crippling, pathetic need to impress his mistress Simone and his demanding mother. Julian finally took a deep breath, uncapped the silver pen, and signed his name with a rapid, messy scrawl. He officially authorized the $2 million advance payment to a fraudulent Delaware shell company. He deliberately stamped the document with his exclusive executive override seal, completely bypassing the strict safety protocols of the entire procurement department. With those few irreversible strokes of ink, Julian completely crossed the point of no return. He was no longer just a cheating, arrogant husband attempting to discard his wife. He was officially a corporate criminal committing a severe federal felony. The digital authorization immediately popped up on my administrative dashboard as a critical high-priority alert. I swiftly downloaded the signed document, heavily encrypted the file, and placed it securely next to the pristine audio recording of their balcony conversation. The digital evidence was absolute, entirely undeniable, and utterly devastating to his future. Julian leaned back in his expensive leather chair, rubbing his temples nervously, as DeAndre grinned triumphantly across the desk. DeAndre smoothly took the signed contract, sliding it back into his leather portfolio. He confidently told Julian that the $2 million would hit the Onyx account by Wednesday morning, and the first massive kickback would be quietly routed to Julian's private offshore account by Friday afternoon. They shook hands firmly, completely unaware that the supreme owner of the entire corporate conglomerate was watching their every single move in high definition. As soon as DeAndre left the office, Julian immediately picked up his personal phone and called Simone. I listened as he arrogantly bragged about a massive new deal he had just closed, aggressively promising to take her shopping for whatever luxury items she desired. He was enthusiastically planning to spend corporate money that he had just stolen directly from my company. While Julian was busy planning his lavish spending spree with highly illegal funds, my sharp attention instantly shifted to a highly sensitive financial alert flashing brightly on my secondary computer monitor. It was an urgent notification from my elite wealth management division at Zephyr Holdings, the predatory lending institution that DeAndre had used to remortgage Vivian and Richard's home. Was a mid-tier regional bank. This specific bank was heavily reliant on aggressively packaging and selling their high-risk debt portfolios to larger institutional investors. This was a very standard practice in the modern financial sector, specifically designed to quickly liquidate risky loans for immediate corporate cash flow. I picked up my highly secure desk phone and instantly called the senior managing director of my private equity wing. He answered on the very first ring, his voice sharp and intensely professional. I firmly directed him to locate the specific debt portfolio originating from that exact regional bank, specifically demanding the bundle containing the newly minted high-interest residential mortgage signed by Richard and Vivian just yesterday. My director quickly tapped his keyboard and informed me that the portfolio was currently being shopped around the secondary market because the underlying assets were considered highly toxic due to the borrower's severely overextended credit histories. The regional bank desperately wanted to offload the massive risk immediately before the loan inevitably defaulted. "Purchase the entire portfolio immediately," I commanded, my voice cold, calculated, and entirely uncompromising. Offer them a generous 5% premium above their initial asking price to guarantee an immediate unlisted financial transaction. I want that specific mortgage note completely transferred to the direct holding accounts of Zephyr Holdings by the absolute end of the business day. I want to personally own the exclusive rights to their debt. My director did not hesitate or ask any unnecessary questions. He simply executed the aggressive financial order. Within exactly 3 hours, the massive transaction was fully cleared through the federal banking system. The regional bank gladly took the premium cash payout, completely unaware of the strategic warfare they had just blindly facilitated. A heavily encrypted digital deed of trust swiftly materialized in my private corporate email inbox. I clicked open the secure file and stared intently at the scanned signatures of Vivian and Richard. They had willingly and eagerly handed over the absolute rights to their cherished ancestral home in the blind pursuit of stolen corporate money. By quietly purchasing their debt portfolio, Zephyr Holdings was now their direct, undeniable legal lender. I effectively owned the exclusive rights to their sprawling suburban property. If they missed a single monthly payment, or if the massive loan was suddenly called in due to highly fraudulent application data, I possessed the absolute legal authority to initiate an immediate ruthless foreclosure and permanently evict them from the premises. I printed the official deed of trust on thick, heavy paper using the laser printer in my office. I slowly traced my finger over Vivian's arrogant, swirling signature. She had spent the entire dinner at the lavish steakhouse aggressively telling me I was a worthless peasant who fundamentally did not belong in her wealthy, sophisticated world. She had attempted to permanently buy my dignity and my silence for a pathetic $50,000 in a paper envelope. Now sitting comfortably in my $10 million penthouse high above the city, I literally and legally owned the very roof over her head. The final trap was now perfectly set. They had foolishly built their own financial guillotine out of pure, unadulterated greed, and all I had to do was patiently wait for the perfect moment to drop the heavy steel blade on their entire family. By Tuesday afternoon, Julian decided it was time to solidify his new social standing. He genuinely believed the fraudulent Onyx Consulting wire transfer was safely processing through the slow corporate bureaucracy, and his massive ego demanded an immediate, highly visible celebration. He wanted to permanently secure his new high society life, and that meant officially locking down Simone. He picked her up from her prestigious law office in a rented luxury sports car, desperate to maintain his pathetic illusion of endless wealth. They drove straight to the most exclusive appointment-only jewelry boutique in the heart of the Buckhead district. This was not a standard mall jeweler. This was a private, highly fortified showroom that catered exclusively to professional athletes, wealthy politicians, and the true elite of Atlanta. The showroom featured armed security guards wearing tailored suits, heavy velvet ropes, and private viewing rooms where expensive vintage champagne was served in delicate crystal flutes. Simone walked into the boutique like she personally owned the entire building. She aggressively demanded to see only the highest tier of flawless, unblemished diamonds. Julian sat nervously on a plush velvet sofa, trying desperately to look relaxed as the boutique manager carefully brought out trays of breathtaking stones. Simone arrogantly dismissed anything under 5 carats, rudely waving her hand at pieces that cost more than most people made in a year. She finally pointed her manicured finger at a massive radiant cut diamond set in a custom heavy platinum band. It was a ridiculously ostentatious ring completely devoid of subtle elegance, but absolutely dripping in sheer financial value. The boutique manager smiled politely and informed them the ring cost exactly $100,000. Simone did not even blink at the massive price tag. She simply turned her head, looked directly at Julian, and waited silently for him to pull out his wallet. She expected to be treated like absolute royalty, and her affection was entirely conditional on his immediate ability to fund her lavish, demanding lifestyle. Julian confidently pulled out his sleek black platinum personal credit card. He handed it to the manager with a smug, arrogant smile plastered across his face. He genuinely believed that the severe financial lockdown from the steakhouse incident had been quietly resolved by the banking representatives he had aggressively yelled at the previous morning. He leaned back on the velvet sofa, taking a slow sip of his complimentary champagne, eagerly waiting for the admiring smiles of the boutique staff. He wanted Simone to look at him with pure adoration. He wanted to feel like the powerful chief executive officer he pretended to be in front of the mirror. 10 long minutes passed in painful silence. The polite, welcoming smiles of the boutique staff slowly began to fade. The manager walked back into the private viewing room, completely empty-handed. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, nervously adjusting his pristine silk tie. He leaned down and spoke in a very low, highly discreet whisper to avoid embarrassing his client. He quietly informed Julian that the platinum card had been aggressively declined. The bank terminal had immediately displayed a hard fraud lock code, and the issuing bank had explicitly instructed the merchant to confiscate the physical card. Julian felt a cold, terrifying sweat break out across his neck. He quickly pulled out his shiny Apex Tech corporate expense card, the exact one he assumed was safely insulated from his personal banking issues. He shoved the plastic into the manager's hand aggressively, ordering him to run it as a standard corporate executive expense. 5 agonizing minutes later, the manager returned again. The corporate card was completely dead. The terminal indicated that the card was heavily locked under a severe internal compliance audit initiated directly by the parent company holding group. The massive transaction was mathematically and systematically impossible to process. Simone sharply noticed the panicked, desperate exchange. Her perfectly sculpted face hardened instantly. She placed her crystal champagne glass down on the glass table with a sharp, echoing clack. "What exactly is the problem here, Julian?" she demanded, her voice dripping with sudden suspicion and deep, unfiltered annoyance. You explicitly told me you had complete, unrestricted control of your finances. Are you seriously telling me the chief executive officer of Apex Tech cannot afford to buy a simple engagement ring? Julian looked at Simone and he saw the absolute brutal reality of their relationship reflecting in her cold eyes. If he could not physically buy that massive ring right now, she would confidently walk out the heavy glass doors and never return his phone calls. She would ruthlessly tell everyone in her elite social circle that he was a broke, pathetic fraud. He would instantly become a massive laughingstock in the exact community he was desperate to conquer. His incredibly fragile ego simply could not handle the sheer humiliation. He desperately needed to save face at any cost. He quickly lied to Simone and the manager, claiming that there was simply a massive bureaucratic hold on his accounts due to a recent highly complex corporate merger. He aggressively promised to wire the money directly from his secure executive accounts to the boutique. He demanded complete privacy and quickly stepped out into the quiet marble hallway of the luxury showroom. Julian was rapidly spiraling into a full-blown terrifying panic attack. The heavily fraudulent Onyx consulting money from DeAndre was absolutely not scheduled to hit his offshore account until late Friday afternoon. He currently had absolutely zero liquid cash to his name. He frantically pulled out his heavily encrypted corporate phone and desperately logged into the Apex Tech Master Administrative Portal. He frantically scrolled through the massive corporate accounting ledgers, searching blindly for any vulnerable financial account that held immediate, unrestricted liquid capital. His darting eyes finally locked onto a highly protected, strictly monitored internal ledger. It was the Emergency Employee Pension Relief Fund. This was a dedicated, sacred pool of liquid cash legally reserved exclusively for retired employees facing severe, unexpected medical emergencies or catastrophic financial hardships. It was heavily regulated money. It was the literal, hard-earned life savings of hundreds of hardworking people who trusted the company to protect their futures. Julian simply did not care. He was a deeply cornered animal, driven entirely by blinding arrogance and profound fear. He quickly reasoned with himself, utilizing the deeply twisted logic of a true unhinged narcissist. He convinced his own mind that he was merely borrowing the funds for a few short days. He promised himself he would simply replace the stolen pension money the exact second the illegal Onyx consulting kickback officially cleared his offshore accounts. Nobody would ever notice the temporary dip in the massive reserve. He aggressively typed the highly secure routing and commercial account numbers of the luxury jewelry boutique directly into the executive wire transfer portal. He manually entered the exact amount of $100,000. The advanced corporate system immediately flashed a bright red screen filling warning, explicitly reminding him that these specific funds were federally protected by the government, and any unauthorized withdrawal constituted a severe prosecuting violation of federal financial regulations. Julian completely ignored the flashing legal warning. He confidently typed in his unique Chief Executive Officer override password and pressed confirm without a single second of hesitation. The digital progress bar loaded quickly, and the massive wire transfer was instantly irreversibly approved. He had just brazenly stolen $100,000 from the retirement funds of his own employees to buy a shiny piece of jewelry for his demanding mistress. Julian let out a heavy, shaking sigh of pure relief, completely unaware of the massive digital explosion he had just actively triggered. He confidently walked back into the private viewing room, expertly plastering a fake, highly arrogant smile back onto his sweating face. He proudly informed the boutique manager that the executive wire transfer had been successfully initiated and the massive funds would hit their commercial account within a matter of minutes. Simone smiled brightly, instantly returning to her affectionate, deeply loving persona. She greedily slipped the massive diamond ring onto her finger, admiring how it caught the light, completely blind to the terrifying fact that it was directly paid for with heavily stolen retirement funds. Julian felt a temporary, intoxicating rush of absolute power. He truly, genuinely believed he had successfully outsmarted the entire corporate financial system. Meanwhile, sitting quietly in my $10 million midtown penthouse, I was taking a slow sip of chilled, sparkling water. The sprawling city below was bustling with heavy afternoon traffic. My massive multi-screen command center was running silently in the background, continuously analyzing millions of data points. Suddenly, my highly secure encrypted tablet lit up with a brilliant, aggressively flashing crimson border. A piercing, high-pitched security alarm sounded loudly through the quiet, luxurious room. It was a critical severity alert originating directly from the Zephyr Holdings artificial intelligence compliance system. I calmly set my glass down on the coaster and walked over to my heavy mahogany desk. I picked up the glowing tablet and carefully read the highly detailed financial report flashing rapidly across the high-definition screen. The advanced monitoring system had instantly flagged a massive, highly irregular wire transfer originating directly from the Apex Tech Emergency Employee Pension Relief Fund. I slowly traced the digital routing numbers displayed on the screen. The stolen funds were moving rapidly through the secure federal banking system, landing squarely and undeniably in the registered commercial account of a luxury jewelry boutique located in Buckhead. The illegal transaction was personally authorized, digitally stamped, and permanently recorded using Julian's unique, heavily restricted executive override credentials. I stared intently at the glowing screen, a slow, incredibly cold smile spreading widely across my face. I had fully expected Julian to be reckless, greedy, and morally bankrupt, but I never in my wildest dreams imagined he would be this incredibly historically stupid. Embezzling corporate funds through a fake vendor contract with his brother-in-law was a severe crime, but actively stealing directly from a federally protected employee pension fund was a completely different, terrifying level of rapid corporate suicide. The Department of Labor and the Federal Bureau of Investigation treated employee pension theft with absolute, uncompromising zero tolerance. By dipping his greedy hands into that specific highly regulated fund, Julian had instantly elevated his pathetic crimes from standard corporate fraud to a massive, undeniable federal indictment carrying decades of mandatory, unforgiving prison time. He had just willingly handed me the exact, undeniable financial crime I desperately needed to completely destroy him. There was absolutely no defense attorney in the entire world, not even the arrogant, highly educated Simone Hayes, who could legally justify a chief executive officer wiring employee retirement funds directly to a luxury jewelry store for an engagement ring. The digital paper trail was absolutely perfect, completely permanent, and utterly devastating. Julian actually thought he was cleverly buying his way into the true elite society, but he had just unknowingly purchased a one-way, non-refundable ticket to a federal penitentiary. The elaborate trap was now fully loaded, the evidence was solidly secured in my heavily encrypted servers, and it was finally time to corner the rats. Thursday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept through the busy streets of downtown Atlanta. The official divorce mediation was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp at the highly prestigious commercial offices of Vanguard and Hayes. This was the exact same elite family law firm where Simone worked as a highly paid junior partner, and much more importantly, it was the exact same firm that now unknowingly paid triple their monthly commercial rent directly into my hidden corporate holding accounts. I chose my outfit for the mediation session very carefully. I deliberately wore a plain, slightly faded beige sweater, inexpensive dark slacks, and the exact same scuffed black heels I had worn to the disastrous dinner at the steakhouse. I needed them to firmly believe I was utterly defeated, financially ruined, and desperately intimidated by their overwhelming display of generational wealth and aggressive legal power. I walked into the massive glass-enclosed conference room located on the 40th floor of the towering building. The sweeping panoramic views of the entire city skyline were intentionally designed to make opposing legal parties feel incredibly small and entirely insignificant. Sitting precisely at the head of the heavy mahogany table was a neutral court-appointed mediator. Sitting directly across from my empty chair were Julian and Simone. Julian was wearing a sharp, freshly tailored designer suit, his chest aggressively puffed out with unearned, arrogant confidence. Simone was sitting right next to him, officially acting as his primary legal counsel. She was wearing a perfectly fitted white blazer and resting heavily on her left hand, purposely placed on top of the black leather binder, was the massive radiant cut diamond engagement ring Julian had illegally purchased just 2 days ago. I stared at the sparkling $100,000 stone for a brief, silent second. To Simone, that ring was an ultimate symbol of her complete victory over a lesser woman. To me, it was a highly visible, brilliantly cut piece of federal state evidence. The court mediator politely cleared his throat and officially opened the legal session, clearly stating that the primary goal of the morning was to reach an amicable dissolution of the marriage without requiring a lengthy, expensive, and public courtroom trial. Simone did not even let the mediator finish his standard opening statement. She immediately slid a thick, heavily bound legal document across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right in front of me. It was the absolute final marital settlement agreement. Simone leaned forward confidently, steepling her manicured fingers together in a classic, highly aggressive lawyer pose, designed specifically to establish immediate dominance in the room. Let us save everyone in this room some extremely valuable billable hours. Simone began, her voice dripping with extreme, unfiltered condescension. My client is a highly compensated chief executive officer of a major technology firm. You are a low-wage charity worker with absolutely no significant assets. The financial disparity in this brief marriage is massive, and we have carefully structured this legal settlement to accurately reflect the undeniable reality of your extremely limited financial contributions. Under the strict terms of this binding agreement, my client will retain absolute sole ownership of the primary marital residence located in the suburbs, all luxury vehicles currently registered in his name, and the absolute entirety of his corporate stock options, executive performance bonuses, and extensive pension portfolios associated with his employment at Apex Tech. Simone paused for a brief moment, her eyes locking onto mine, making absolutely sure I was adequately absorbing the heavy legal blows she was aggressively delivering. She confidently flipped to the third page of the dense document, tapping her finger sharply against a specific highlighted paragraph. Furthermore, you will completely and permanently forfeit any and all legal claims to future spousal support, commonly known as alimony. You will immediately assume total individual liability for any minor consumer debt acquired on your personal credit cards. In exchange for your immediate uncontested signature today, my client is generously offering a one-time lump sum severance payment of exactly $5,000. This is an incredibly gracious offer, Zaria. If you foolishly refuse to sign this agreement today, I will personally file an aggressive, relentless litigation strategy that will legally compel you to pay half of my client's exorbitant attorney fees, which currently exceed your entire annual salary. Julian shifted comfortably in his plush leather chair, looking directly at me with a sickening, infuriating mixture of fake pity and supreme arrogance. Look, Zaria. Julian said, his voice deliberately dropping into a patronizing, soothing tone, as if he were trying to explain a complex concept to a very slow child. I know this is a massive amount of information for you to process right now. You simply do not understand how corporate finance and high-level asset division actually work in the real world. Simone is just doing her job by protecting my hard-earned legacy. You have to understand that I am entering a completely different echelon of elite society. I cannot have my massive financial portfolio tied down by a messy, drawn-out divorce. Take the $5,000. It is more than enough for you to put down a security deposit on a small apartment back in your old neighborhood. You can easily start over. Just sign the paper and let us both move on with our lives. I remained completely, perfectly silent. I did not argue with his ridiculous logic. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not even bother to look slightly offended by his profound disrespect. I simply picked up the thick legal document and began to slowly, methodically read through the complex pages. My prolonged calm silence clearly irritated Simone. She was a woman who thrived entirely on dramatic conflict, and she desperately wanted me to cry, scream, or throw a tantrum so she could feel the full, intoxicating rush of personally destroying me. Are you having trouble understanding the complex legal terminology? Simone mocked loudly, leaning back in her expensive chair and intentionally resting her hand directly on Julian's arm, aggressively flashing the stolen diamond ring again. I know the legal vernacular can be quite intimidating for someone without a proper advanced education. I can simplify it for you if it is truly necessary. In basic terms, it means you get absolutely nothing, Zarya. You lose everything. I completely ignored her petty childish insults, my eyes scanning the dense text of the document until I found the exact legal clause I was desperately looking for. It was buried deep on page 12, meticulously typed under the section titled Severance of Mutual Liability. The airtight clause explicitly stated that upon the immediate execution of this legal document, all financial ties, joint accounts, and shared responsibilities between the two parties were permanently and irrevocably severed. It legally established that neither party could ever be held civilly, criminally, or financially liable for any debts, fraudulent actions, or federal obligations incurred by the other party moving forward, and it completely dissolved all joint marital property protections. This was the true, undeniable masterpiece of their profound, staggering stupidity. Simone genuinely thought she was using this highly aggressive clause to permanently protect Julian's future millions from my supposedly greedy hands. She actually thought she was building an impenetrable, ironclad legal fortress around his massive Apex Tech executive salary. She had absolutely no idea that she had just carefully drafted the exact flawless legal shield I desperately needed to comprehensively protect my own billionaire empire from the massive impending blast radius of his severe federal crimes. If we stayed legally married for even a few more weeks, Julian's massive corporate fraud, his blatant embezzlement of $2 million, and his direct, unforgivable theft of federal employee pensions could potentially trigger highly complex marital asset investigations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission would inevitably freeze all connected financial accounts during their intense, sweeping federal probe. By aggressively forcing this expedited zero-asset divorce upon me, and by aggressively demanding I sign a complete severance of mutual liability, Simone was legally and permanently untethering my name from a rapidly sinking ship just seconds before it violently exploded. She was actively doing my highly paid team of corporate lawyers a massive, incredibly expensive favor entirely for free. I slowly looked up from the heavy document. I met Julian's arrogant, dismissive gaze, and then I looked directly into Simone's smug, intensely triumphant eyes. "Do you happen to have a pen?" I asked softly, my voice perfectly steady and completely calm. Simone's arrogant smile immediately widened into a vicious, deeply satisfied grin. She quickly pulled a heavy, incredibly expensive fountain pen from her designer leather briefcase and practically shoved it across the table toward me. Smart girl, Simone sneered loudly. "For a quick second there, I thought you were actually going to try and fight a legal battle you could never possibly win." I took the pen. The heavy metal felt incredibly cool and solid in my hand. I flipped directly to the final signature page of the binding document. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I did not let my hand shake. I firmly and cleanly signed my full legal name on the dotted line, officially dissolving my marriage to Julian, and permanently severing every single legal and financial tie I had to his toxic, rapidly collapsing life. I slid the newly signed document back across the polished mahogany table. The neutral mediator quickly reviewed the fresh signatures, officially stamped the document with his heavy metal notary seal, and formally declared the mediation session successfully concluded. Julian let out a loud, highly dramatic sigh of pure relief. He actually reached across the table and high-fived Simone right there in the professional conference room. They were openly celebrating their perceived victory, completely unable to contain their sheer, unadulterated joy. I stood up slowly from my chair, casually smoothing out my cheap beige sweater. You absolutely did the right thing today, Zarya Julian said, standing up quickly and proudly buttoning his tailored suit jacket. My executive assistant will wire the $5,000 directly to your basic checking account by the absolute end of the business day. I truly wish you the best of luck in your little charity ventures. I picked up my inexpensive purse and looked at the two of them, celebrating their entirely hollow, utterly meaningless victory. Good luck with your exciting new life, Julian, I said calmly, my face a perfect, unreadable mask. And Simone, that is a truly breathtaking diamond ring. You should really cherish it while you can. Things of that incredible financial value rarely last very long in this world. I turned around and confidently walked out of the massive conference room. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, I found Vivian and Richard waiting eagerly in the luxurious reception area of the law firm. Vivian was holding a glossy luxury real estate magazine, undoubtedly picking out new vacation homes with the imaginary millions she firmly believed DeAndre was securing for them. When she saw Julian and Simone walk out right behind me with the finalized papers in hand, Vivian actually clapped her hands together in pure, unfiltered delight. It is finally over. Vivian cheered loudly, completely ignoring the professional decorum of the quiet law office. She walked right past me without a single glance and pulled Julian into a massive, highly theatrical hug. I am so incredibly proud of you, my perfect son. You are finally completely free from that heavy anchor. Now you can truly focus on building your massive corporate empire with a brilliant woman who actually understands our elite family values. Richard nodded approvingly, patting Julian heavily on the back. It is a truly great day for this family, Richard added, looking directly at me with cold, brutal dismissal. You made the absolute right choice by not fighting us today, Zarya. We would have completely crushed you in open court. I just looked at the four of them standing happily together in the expensive lobby. The deeply arrogant mother who had blindly remortgaged her ancestral home for a pathetic scam. The completely foolish father who blindly followed her lead. The cheating coward of a husband who had just brazenly embezzled federal pension funds. And the smug, completely compromised mistress proudly wearing stolen diamonds. They were the absolute perfect portrait of a doomed, rapidly collapsing family. I stepped into the waiting elevator and pressed the button for the main lobby, when the heavy steel doors finally slid shut entirely. Cutting off the obnoxious sound of their arrogant family celebration, I finally allowed myself to truly smile. It was a cold, incredibly ruthless smile. They genuinely believed they had just outsmarted me, severely intimidated me, and tossed me onto the unforgiving street with absolutely nothing. They were completely, utterly blind to the terrifying, inescapable reality of what had just legally occurred in that conference room. By ruthlessly rushing the divorce, stripping me of all marital assets, and officially cutting all financial ties on federal paper, they had just legally insulated me from the massive career-ending federal indictment I was currently preparing to drop squarely on their heads. They had securely locked themselves inside a rapidly burning building, and they had just willingly handed me the only key to the exit. The complex legal paperwork was completely finalized. The devastating financial traps were fully set. The undeniable federal evidence was securely uploaded to my servers. There were absolutely no loose ends left to tie. It was finally time to execute the hostile corporate takeover. The weekend following the expedited divorce mediation was a masterclass in profound financial delusion. By late Friday afternoon, the massive $2 million wire transfer Julian had illegally authorized finally cleared the federal banking system. The heavily stolen corporate funds landed securely in the fraudulent Delaware commercial account registered to DeAndre's entirely fake enterprise, Onyx Consulting. Sitting at my secure workstation, I watched the digital transaction log update in real time. Almost immediately, DeAndre began aggressively siphoning the money out of the shell company. He transferred a massive kickback directly into Julian's newly established offshore account, fully believing he was successfully hiding the transaction from federal regulators. He then boldly distributed the remaining stolen capital among the rest of the family, framing it as a highly lucrative dividend from his brilliant financial investments. The moment the stolen cash hit their personal checking accounts, the entire family completely lost their minds. They had lived their entire adult lives desperately pretending to be wealthy, and now fueled entirely by stolen employee pension funds and blatant corporate embezzlement, they launched into a manic, highly aggressive spending spree. They wanted to permanently announce their arrival to the absolute top tier of Atlanta society. Chloe was the first to strike. Early Saturday morning, she practically sprinted into the most exclusive luxury boutiques in the upscale shopping district. Through my private security network, I accessed the financial authorization requests, bouncing off the commercial banking servers. Chloe aggressively purchased 3 incredibly rare Birkin bags in a single afternoon, swiping her newly funded debit card with reckless abandon. She did not stop there. She bought custom designer shoes, heavily branded silk scarves, and absurdly expensive sunglasses. She was desperately trying to buy a personality, completely unaware that true wealth never screams for attention. DeAndre decided he needed a vehicle that properly reflected his completely fabricated status as a high-level corporate financial genius. He marched directly into a high-end imported car dealership and aggressively demanded the most expensive luxury SUV on the showroom floor. He purchased a brand new fully loaded Mercedes G-Wagon, paying a massive premium entirely in cash to drive it off the lot that exact same day. He practically strutted around the dealership, loudly bragging to the commission-hungry salesman about his massive consulting contracts and his supposed brilliant real estate acquisitions. He actually believed the lies he was aggressively selling to everyone around him. Vivian, however, was determined to secure the ultimate symbol of high society validation. She drove her least luxury sedan straight to the Piedmont Estates Country Club, the exact same highly exclusive venue where Simone had intentionally ruined my silk dress. Vivian proudly marched into the membership office and aggressively slammed a cashier's check for $50,000 down on the polished mahogany desk. It was the complete non-refundable initiation fee for an elite top-tier family membership. She loudly demanded immediate access to the private dining rooms, the championship golf courses, and the highly exclusive spa facilities. She wanted every single wealthy woman in her social circle to see her sitting on the pristine country club patios, sipping expensive champagne, and acting like she had been born into massive generational wealth. Meanwhile, Julian and Simone were busy playing the roles of the ultimate corporate power couple. Julian completely ignored the flashing red warning signs of his deeply compromised corporate accounts and fully embraced his stolen millions. He rented a massive, highly exclusive VIP section at the most expensive nightclub in the city, aggressively ordering endless bottles of premium liquor. Simone stood right by his side, making absolutely sure the dramatic club lighting perfectly caught the heavy facets of her stolen $100,000 diamond engagement ring. If they had simply kept their stolen wealth entirely quiet, they might have bought themselves a few more weeks of blissful, ignorant freedom. But people who are starved for attention and desperate for social validation can never truly enjoy their money in complete silence. They desperately needed the entire world to aggressively validate their highly fabricated success. They needed a massive audience. Massive. By Sunday afternoon, my massive monitors were completely flooded with their frantic, highly obnoxious social media activity. The family had launched a highly coordinated, incredibly aggressive campaign on Instagram to aggressively flaunt their newly acquired wealth. I sat back in my plush leather chair, slowly sipping my dark roast coffee, completely mesmerized by their sheer unadulterated stupidity. Chloe posted a massive high-definition photo gallery of her pristine designer shopping bags stacked dangerously high in the grand foyer of her parents' home. She captioned the highly edited photos with obnoxious quotes about manifesting wealth and outgrowing toxic people. She aggressively tagged every single luxury brand she had purchased, explicitly making sure to add the hashtag Atlanta Black Elite to every single post. DeAndre posted a heavily filtered video of himself aggressively revving the massive engine of his newly purchased G-Wagon, proudly holding up a thick stack of $100 bills to the camera lens. He loudly declared to his minimal followers that hard work and elite financial strategy always paid off. Vivian posted a highly staged, completely unnatural photo of herself sitting on the manicured terrace of the exclusive country club, holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne. She wrote a lengthy, incredibly arrogant caption about how her family had finally secured their rightful place among the true royalty of the city. And Simone, never one to miss an opportunity to publicly gloat, posted a close-up high-definition video of her massive diamond ring sparkling brilliantly under the club lights, loudly tagging Julian as the greatest, most successful chief executive officer in the entire corporate world. They were publicly aggressively documenting their massive federal crimes in vivid, undeniable high definition. They were literally providing federal prosecutors with a perfect, heavily time-stamped digital roadmap of exactly how and where they were spending the stolen corporate capital. Every single post was a massive glowing beacon pointing directly to their severe financial fraud. I placed my coffee cup down on the desk and immediately went to work. This was the exact critical moment I had been patiently waiting for. I rapidly opened a highly secure, heavily encrypted digital dossier on my primary workstation. I systematically downloaded every single obnoxious photograph, every arrogant video clip, and every highly incriminating caption they had foolishly posted to their public social media accounts. I explicitly made sure to capture the exact digital timestamps and the highly specific geographical location tags permanently embedded in the metadata of their public uploads. Next, I seamlessly integrated the highly classified financial documents my team had secretly extracted from the corporate servers. I attached the original fraudulent $2 million vendor contract Julian had illegally signed with his unique executive override credentials. I carefully included the highly restricted digital wire transfer logs, proving Julian had aggressively stolen $100,000 directly from the Protected Emergency Employee Pension Relief Fund to purchase Simone's diamond ring. Finally, I attached the pristine, undeniable bank statements from DeAndre's entirely fake Delaware shell company, clearly showing the massive influx of stolen corporate capital and the immediate aggressive distribution of those exact funds into their personal checking accounts. I arranged the massive mountain of undeniable evidence into a completely flawless, incredibly easy-to-read digital timeline. I meticulously cross-referenced every single luxury purchase they proudly flaunted on Instagram with the exact corresponding illegal withdrawal from the stolen corporate funds. It was a completely airtight, utterly devastating presentation of severe coordinated federal financial fraud. I leaned forward, the bright light of the massive monitors reflecting in my eyes. I opened a highly secure, completely untraceable dark web communication portal designed specifically for anonymous federal whistleblower submissions. I did not bother sending this massive dossier to the local police department or the regional authorities. Those agencies moved far too slowly and were entirely unequipped to handle massive multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement schemes. I needed an immediate, completely overwhelming, and highly destructive federal response. I carefully addressed the first encrypted email directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS absolutely loved targeting highly arrogant individuals who brazenly flaunted massive, entirely unexplained wealth on social media without filing the corresponding massive tax returns. I then addressed the exact same heavily encrypted dossier directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, explicitly flagging the severe corporate fraud and the massive theft of federally protected employee pension funds by a sitting chief executive officer of a major technology firm. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen for a brief, highly satisfying second. The entire family was currently sitting in their massive suburban homes or driving their luxury vehicles, genuinely believing they were completely untouchable. They thought they had entirely defeated me. They thought they had permanently secured their bright, incredibly wealthy future. They were absolutely, completely wrong. Absolutely. I confidently pressed the enter key. The massive, heavily encrypted dossier instantly vanished from my private network, securely transmitting directly into the highly active inbox queues of the most ruthless federal investigators in the entire country. The heavy digital payload was officially delivered. The completely fake, highly fabricated illusion of the elite was about to be violently shattered by the absolute, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement. 2 days later, the morning of the highly anticipated Apex Tech annual gala finally arrived. Through my comprehensive audio surveillance network, I listened to Julian pacing aggressively back and forth across the hardwood floors of his massive master bedroom. He was loudly rehearsing his upcoming keynote speech for the evening. He was absolutely determined to deliver a performance that would permanently cement his legacy as a brilliant corporate visionary. I could hear the sheer, unfiltered arrogance dripping from his voice as he practiced delivering his completely fabricated financial statistics. He boldly planned to stand on a brightly lit stage in front of hundreds of wealthy investors and confidently announce record-breaking quarterly profit margins. He genuinely intended to claim that under his brilliant new executive leadership, the company had successfully streamlined massive operational costs and secured incredibly lucrative new consulting partnerships. He was actively planning to brag about the exact fraudulent Delaware shell company that was currently funneling stolen corporate capital directly into his personal offshore bank accounts. Julian was not just planning to lie about his financial performance, he was planning the ultimate highly public display of his fake personal life. I listened closely as he eagerly discussed his grand finale with DeAndre over the phone. After he delivered his fraudulent financial report, Julian intended to call Simone up onto the main stage. In front of the entire corporate board, local politicians, and the elite society of Atlanta, he was going to drop down on one knee and officially propose to his mistress. He wanted the heavy diamond ring, the one he had illegally purchased with stolen employee retirement funds, to sparkle brightly under the theatrical spotlights. He wanted thunderous applause. He wanted absolute adoration. He was completely blind to the terrifying reality that he was eagerly preparing to propose with stolen federal property. While Julian was busy picking out his custom-tailored tuxedo and practicing his arrogant smile in the mirror, I was hosting a very different kind of meeting in the massive glass-enclosed boardroom of my penthouse. Sitting around my polished mahogany conference table were the true incredibly powerful members of the Zephyr Holdings board of directors. These were ruthless, highly experienced billionaires who controlled massive global markets. They had absolutely no patience for corporate thieves. Sitting directly across from them were 3 senior investigative agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, alongside 2 lead forensic accountants from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I stood at the head of the long table, the massive digital screen behind me, displaying the flawless, heavily encrypted dossier I had submitted over the weekend. The federal agents had moved with unprecedented, terrifying speed. When they verified the undeniable digital signatures, the illegal wire transfer logs linking directly to the Protected Employee Pension Fund, and the completely transparent social media posts documenting the massive spending spree, they instantly escalated the case to a top-tier federal priority. The senior federal agent, a tall, incredibly imposing man with sharp gray eyes, leaned forward and placed a heavy stack of freshly signed federal arrest warrants directly onto the polished mahogany table. He looked around the quiet room, his expression completely devoid of any sympathy. "The evidence you provided is absolutely overwhelming, Zarya," the senior agent stated clearly, his voice echoing slightly in the massive room. "We have successfully frozen the fraudulent offshore accounts, and we have fully authorized a coordinated tactical strike. We are fully prepared to move in and apprehend the targets immediately." I looked at the heavy federal warrants resting on the table. A standard corporate arrest would simply involve agents quietly showing up at Julian's suburban house early in the morning and escorting him away in handcuffs before the neighbors could even wake up. But that was far too quiet. That would allow Vivian, Chloe, and Simone to easily spin a fake, highly sympathetic narrative. They would publicly claim Julian was deeply misunderstood or falsely accused. They would desperately try to salvage their highly fabricated social status. I needed their destruction to be entirely public, completely undeniable, and utterly humiliating. I needed them to fall from the absolute highest peak they could possibly climb. I do not want them arrested quietly in their homes, I told the senior agent, looking directly into his sharp eyes. Tonight is the Apex Tech annual gala. The entire family will be sitting at the absolute front table. Julian will be standing on the main stage loudly broadcasting his fraudulent crimes to hundreds of our most important corporate investors. I want you to execute the federal arrest warrants tonight, right in the middle of his keynote speech. I want the entire high society of Atlanta to watch the new chief executive officer get publicly stripped of his fake crown. My board of directors nodded in unanimous, ruthless agreement. The lead SEC accountant firmly agreed that a highly public arrest would immediately send a powerful, uncompromising message to the global markets that Zephyr Holdings maintained absolute, terrifying control over its subsidiary executives. The senior federal agent offered a sharp, approving smile. He quickly agreed to coordinate his heavily armed tactical teams with my private executive security forces. We spent the next 3 hours meticulously mapping out the precise operational logistics of the evening. We turned the luxurious ballroom of the downtown Grand Hotel into a highly controlled, inescapable trap. By 7 o'clock that evening, the vibrant downtown streets of Atlanta were completely jammed with massive black luxury cars and expensive stretch limousines. The Apex Tech annual gala was the absolute premier social event of the corporate season. The Grand Hotel was blazing with bright theatrical lights, and a long plush red carpet was explicitly rolled out directly to the main entrance. Hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in sparkling designer gowns and sharp tailored tuxedos were aggressively posing for the flashbulbs of the local press. I sat quietly in the dark, heavily tinted back seat of my armored Escalade parked discreetly in a secure alleyway directly across from the Grand Hotel entrance. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green silk gown that cost more than Vivian's newly purchased country club membership. I held an encrypted digital tablet in my lap, watching the live high-definition security feeds transmitting directly from the massive ballroom. My elite private security forces had fully taken over the entire venue hours ago. On the glowing screen, I watched Julian's rented luxury sports car finally pull up to the bright red carpet. He stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a ridiculously expensive velvet tuxedo jacket, looking incredibly smug and arrogantly confident. He quickly walked around the car and opened the passenger door for Simone. She stepped out onto the red carpet wearing a highly revealing bright crimson designer dress, aggressively flashing her stolen diamond ring directly at the flashing cameras. Right behind them, a massive luxury SUV pulled up. Vivian, Richard, Chloe, and DeAndre stepped out all dressed in heavily branded, obnoxiously expensive clothing, purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds. They clustered tightly together, laughing loudly and aggressively, posing for the photographers, genuinely believing they were the absolute royalty of the city. Julian arrogantly tossed his car keys to the waiting valet. He did not even bother to look the young man in the eye. He simply assumed the valet was just another low-wage worker, existing entirely to serve him. Julian was completely oblivious to the small, highly concealed tactical earpiece resting securely in the valet's right ear. The valet smoothly caught the keys, offering a sharp, highly trained nod, instantly securing the vehicle. The arrogant family confidently marched up the plush red carpet toward the heavy brass doors of the Grand Hotel. They reached the main security checkpoint, loudly demanding immediate VIP access. Julian haughtily flashed his chief executive officer credential badge at the two massive, incredibly muscular security guards standing firmly by the velvet ropes. The guards wore sharp black suits, completely indistinguishable from standard event staff. They politely checked the badges and smoothly unclipped the velvet rope, graciously allowing the entire toxic family to walk directly into the grand foyer. Julian boldly led his family into the massive, glittering venue, his chest puffed out with massive pride. He was eagerly marching toward the bright stage, desperately hungry for his moment of supreme glory. He had absolutely no idea that the valet who just took his keys was a highly trained tactical operative. He had no idea that the polite security guards who just checked his VIP pass were heavily armed mercenaries, strictly employed by my private holding company. He was entirely blind to the terrifying reality that the actual hotel staff had been completely replaced by an elite army of security professionals and undercover federal agents. I watched Julian eagerly walk through the heavy brass doors on my glowing tablet. A slow, incredibly cold smile spread perfectly across my face. The heavy doors closed firmly behind him, and the massive deadbolts quietly slid into place. The trap was absolutely flawless. Julian thought he was confidently walking into his glorious royal coronation. He did not realize he had just willingly walked directly into a highly secured, perfectly locked cage. It was finally time for the real boss to officially make her grand entrance. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was thick with the intoxicating scent of expensive perfume and the relentless hum of high society networking. Hundreds of Atlanta's most influential figures were clustered around tables adorned with towering floral centerpieces and crystal glassware. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos silently navigated the crowded floor, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with premium vintage champagne and delicate appetizers. At the very front of the massive room, positioned directly beneath the largest, most spectacular crystal chandelier, sat the designated VIP table, reserved explicitly for the family of the chief executive officer. Vivian had strategically positioned herself at the center of the table, facing the entire room, so that everyone could clearly see her. She sat rigidly in her designer gown, her chin tilted upward aggressively, demanding the attention and respect of every single passing guest. She was actively performing the role of the ultimate matriarch, offering tight, condescending smiles to the corporate vice presidents and regional managers, who respectfully approached the table to pay their mandatory respects. Richard sat quietly beside her, swirling a glass of dark amber scotch, trying his absolute best to look like a man who commanded a massive financial empire, rather than a man who had just foolishly mortgaged his ancestral home for a completely fabricated corporate scam. Chloe was busy leaning across the table, loudly complaining to DeAndre about the supposedly poor quality of the complimentary caviar. She made absolutely sure to keep her wrist elevated, ensuring the heavy diamond bracelet she had illegally purchased just days ago caught the bright glare of the overhead spotlights. DeAndre completely ignored her complaints, his eyes darting frantically around the crowded room. He was desperately trying to spot wealthy investors to pitch his completely fraudulent consulting firm to genuinely believing he was now a major player in the elite corporate ecosystem. But nobody at the VIP table was commanding more aggressive attention than Simone. She was sitting in the chair closest to the main stage, her bright crimson dress deeply contrasting with the formal black and white attire of the surrounding crowd. She had intentionally placed her left hand high up on the stem of her crystal champagne flute. Every time a new guest approached the table, she made a deliberate, highly exaggerated gesture, aggressively flashing the massive $100,000 stolen diamond engagement ring directly into their eyes. She was loudly introducing herself as Julian's soon-to-be fiancée, completely reveling in the jealous stares of the other wealthy women in the room. They were a collective masterpiece of unearned arrogance, sitting proudly on a massive throne built entirely out of stolen federal funds. At exactly 8:30, the heavy ambient music slowly faded away. The bright overhead chandeliers dimmed slightly, casting a dramatic, highly focused spotlight directly onto the massive main stage. A senior board member, an older man with silver hair, and a highly distinguished voice stepped up to the clear acrylic podium. He tapped the microphone twice, calling the massive ballroom to complete attention. He began reading from a carefully prepared script, loudly praising the incredible resilience and the massive forward momentum of Apex Tech. He spoke highly of the recent corporate transition and finally announced the man of the hour. With a booming, highly enthusiastic voice, he officially introduced the brand new chief executive officer to the stage. The entire ballroom erupted into thunderous, polite applause. Julian stood up from his seat at the VIP table. He aggressively buttoned the center button of his expensive velvet tuxedo jacket and offered a highly practiced, incredibly smug wave to the applauding crowd. He leaned down and quickly kissed Simone on the cheek, whispering a promise that he would call her up to the stage very soon. Vivian actually stood up and clapped louder than anyone else in the massive room, her face beaming with extreme unfiltered pride. Julian confidently marched up the short carpeted stairs to the main stage. He walked directly into the bright, blinding spotlight, genuinely feeling like a conquering king, returning to claim his massive empire. He shook hands firmly with the senior board member, took his position directly behind the transparent acrylic podium, and looked out over the massive sea of wealthy faces. This was the exact moment he had aggressively manipulated, lied, and stolen to achieve. He looked down at the teleprompter screen resting on the podium, which displayed his completely fabricated financial report. He took a deep theatrical breath, aggressively gripping the edges of the podium to project massive corporate strength. He leaned directly into the microphone, his lips parting to deliver the first lie of the evening. "Welcome, distinguished guests." Julian began, his voice booming confidently through the massive speakers lining the ballroom walls. "It is an absolute honor to stand before you tonight as the leader of this incredible company." Julian's voice was violently cut off. The microphone simply died. A loud, sharp electronic pop echoed aggressively through the massive sound system, instantly followed by absolute deafening silence. Julian tapped the microphone firmly with his finger, frowning in deep confusion. He leaned closer and spoke again, but absolutely no sound came out. The teleprompter screen on his podium suddenly flickered violently and completely flatlined, turning entirely pitch black. A low murmur of confusion quickly rippled through the massive crowd. Julian aggressively waved his hand at the audio-visual technicians positioned in the dark control booth at the back of the room, loudly demanding they fix the immediate technical issue. But the technicians were no longer sitting at their control boards. They had been physically escorted out of the booth exactly 3 minutes ago by my heavily armed private security forces. Before Julian could even attempt to apologize to the restless crowd, a massive, incredibly heavy mechanical thud echoed loudly from the back of the room. It was followed instantly by another loud thud, and then another. The guests quickly turned their heads in sheer confusion. The massive brass doors at the main entrance, the heavy wooden doors leading to the kitchens, and the designated emergency fire exits were simultaneously slamming shut. The loud, highly distinct sound of heavy steel deadbolts aggressively sliding into place echoed terrifyingly through the quiet ballroom. My elite security forces had seamlessly engaged the emergency lockdown protocol. The entire venue was now completely sealed from the outside world. Nobody was getting in, and absolutely nobody was getting out. Vivian stood up slightly from her chair, looking frantically around the massive room. DeAndre dropped his champagne glass, the fragile crystal shattering loudly against the polished floor, his deep paranoia finally kicking in. Simone aggressively grabbed the edge of the table, her arrogant smile completely vanishing as the terrifying reality of the locked doors set in. Julian stood completely frozen on the stage, his intense panic rapidly rising. He desperately gripped the podium, entirely unsure of what to do next. Then the entire ballroom plunged into complete, absolute darkness. Every single overhead chandelier, every wall sconce, and the bright stage spotlight instantly died. A collective gasp of pure shock erupted from the wealthy crowd. People blindly grabbed onto each other in the pitch-black room. The carefully cultivated atmosphere of elite corporate elegance was instantly shattered, replaced entirely by a heavy, suffocating wave of genuine terror. For exactly 10 agonizing seconds, the massive ballroom remained entirely dark and terrifyingly silent. The elite society of Atlanta was trapped inside a massive steel cage. Then a massive beam of bright, blinding blue light sliced aggressively through the suffocating darkness. The massive high-definition projector screen positioned directly behind Julian suddenly roared to life. The massive screen did not display the Apex Tech corporate logo. It did not display the fabricated financial charts Julian had meticulously prepared. Instead, the bright blue screen illuminated the entire dark stage, casting a harsh, terrifying glow over Julian's pale, sweating face. Imprinted squarely in the center of the massive screen, in sharp, completely uncompromising silver lettering, was a massive corporate logo. It read, Zephyr Holdings. A collective wave of highly confused whispers rapidly swept through the trapped audience. They were highly educated corporate investors. They instantly recognized the name of the anonymous, terrifyingly powerful billionaire conglomerate that had quietly acquired their company. But absolutely nobody understood why the holding company was violently hijacking the annual celebration. Julian slowly turned his head to look at the massive screen behind him. His eyes widened in absolute unfiltered horror. His massive, highly inflated ego completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. He suddenly realized with terrifying clarity that he was absolutely not in control of this event. He was a highly vulnerable pawn standing blindly on a massive, unforgiving chessboard. Suddenly, the heavy, highly fortified metal doors leading directly to the venue's massive industrial loading bay violently groaned open. The loading bay was positioned at the far side of the massive ballroom, directly adjacent to the main stage. The loud grinding of the metal tracks echoed aggressively over the terrified whispers of the crowd. Two blindingly bright LED headlights aggressively pierced the dim light of the ballroom. A massive, completely customized black Maybach limousine slowly and smoothly rolled directly out of the industrial loading bay and drove aggressively onto the polished floor of the massive ballroom. The heavy luxury vehicle came to a complete, perfectly smooth stop right next to the main stage, its bright headlights illuminating the terrified faces of Vivian Richard, Chloe DeAndre, and Simone at the front table. Four heavily armed, massive tactical security agents wearing completely black body armor instantly stepped out of the shadows, aggressively taking strategic positions around the luxury vehicle. The crowd was completely paralyzed by the massive display of extreme corporate power. The rear door of the black Maybach slowly unlocked with a sharp, heavy click. Julian stared blindly at the dark-tinted window, his entire body shaking violently under his tailored velvet suit. He had absolutely no idea who was about to step out of that car, but he knew with absolute certainty that his incredibly brief, highly fraudulent reign as the King of Atlanta was permanently over. The suffocating silence in the room stretched into eternity, every single wealthy guest completely holding their breath, waiting for the supreme authority of Zephyr Holdings to finally reveal themselves to the entire world. The absolute destruction of his entire family was officially underway. The heavy door of the heavily customized black Maybach swung open with a smooth, completely silent glide that only the absolute highest tier of automotive engineering could possibly achieve. A polished leather boot stepped out firmly onto the pristine ballroom floor. I emerged slowly from the dark interior of the luxurious vehicle, the bright, piercing blue light from the massive Zephyr Holdings projector screen instantly illuminating my silhouette. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-designed emerald green silk gown. It was a true masterpiece of quiet, uncompromising luxury, completely devoid of the flashy, obnoxious designer logos that my former in-laws so desperately craved. The fabric draped perfectly around my frame, crafted with an impeccable, highly sophisticated elegance that immediately commanded absolute, undeniable respect from every single person in the room. My hair was styled in a sleek, elegant updo, and resting lightly against my collarbone was a single, flawless diamond necklace that subtly caught the harsh glare of the overhead spotlights. I absolutely did not look like the poor, uneducated, discarded charity worker they had aggressively mocked and ruthlessly humiliated just days ago at the upscale steakhouse. I looked exactly like what I truly was. A woman who possessed the immense financial power to buy and sell every single arrogant person in that massive building before they even finished their morning coffee. The chaotic, terrified murmurs of the massive ballroom instantly vanished, replaced entirely by a dead, suffocating silence. You could literally hear the quiet hum of the massive industrial air conditioning units kicking in. Hundreds of the most powerful corporate investors, influential local politicians, and elite Atlanta socialites stared directly at me in complete, unadulterated shock. They had absolutely no idea who I was personally, but the sheer overwhelming display of aggressive tactical force accompanying my highly dramatic arrival clearly signaled that I possessed a terrifying level of corporate power they could not even begin to comprehend. Down at the front, VIP table positioned directly in the shadow of the main stage, the collective reaction of my deeply toxic former family was a spectacular, highly satisfying display of profound, staggering ignorance. Chloe literally dropped her jaw, her mouth hanging wide open, in completely unfiltered disbelief. Her eyes darted frantically between my expensive designer gown and the massive, heavily armed tactical security guards, establishing a secure perimeter around my vehicle. DeAndre aggressively gripped the edge of the table with both hands, his knuckles turning completely white. He was entirely bewildered by the sudden, highly aggressive appearance of the heavy luxury vehicle, completely unable to process how anyone could successfully breach a locked corporate event. Simone aggressively squinted her eyes, her perfectly sculpted face rapidly twisting into a nasty, hateful scowl. She genuinely, foolishly believed I had somehow managed to sneak past the front security doors simply to cause a pathetic, desperate scene to win back my former husband. But it was Vivian who reacted with the most aggressive, completely unhinged display of unfiltered arrogance. The sheer sight of me standing proudly in the center of the locked ballroom, looking vastly more elegant, poised, and powerful than she ever could in her entire fabricated life, completely short-circuited her highly inflated ego. Her deeply rooted hatred for me instantly overrode any basic sense of situational awareness or logical self-preservation. Vivian aggressively pushed her heavy dining chair back the carved wooden legs, scraping loudly and obnoxiously against the polished floor. She stood up to her full height, her face turning a bright, furious shade of crimson that heavily clashed with her expensive designer gown. She pointed a shaking, heavily manicured finger directly at me, her diamond bracelets loudly clinking together in the deafening silence of the massive room. "What in the world is this pathetic, crazy woman doing here?" Vivian screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her shrill, highly grating voice echoing aggressively through the completely silent ballroom. She is a completely unhinged stalker. She is absolutely insane. She has absolutely no business being at a highly exclusive private corporate event. Vivian violently turned her head toward the massive, heavily armed tactical security guards, standing in a tight, highly disciplined perimeter around my luxury vehicle. "Grab her right now," Vivian commanded aggressively, waving her hand in the air like a tyrannical queen ordering her loyal subjects. "Do you incompetent people not know who we are? My brilliant son is the chief executive officer of this entire corporate conglomerate. We demand that you physically remove this crazy, desperate woman from the premises right this exact second. Throw her out into the cold street where she rightfully belongs and permanently lock the doors behind her." Vivian stood there panting heavily, her chest heaving with deep, arrogant indignation, fully expecting the massive tactical guards to instantly obey her royal commands. She eagerly waited for them to aggressively grab my arms, forcefully, march me across the massive ballroom, and physically drag me away in utter, complete humiliation in front of the entire elite society of Atlanta. Instead, absolutely nothing happened. The massive tactical agents did not even blink at her highly aggressive, hysterical screaming. They remained completely motionless, their faces entirely devoid of any emotion, their sharp eyes continuously scanning the dark perimeter of the locked room to ensure absolute operational security. The lead executive security director, a highly decorated, incredibly intimidating former military operative wearing a sharp black suit and a secure communications earpiece, calmly stepped forward from the shadows of the vehicle. He completely, utterly ignored Vivian's furious, demanding commands. He turned his imposing body directly toward me, clicked his heels together, slightly dipped his head in a deep, highly respectful bow of absolute submission, and formally offered me a clear, unobstructed path directly toward the main stage. Vivian physically gasped, a loud, highly dramatic sound of pure, unadulterated shock escaping her throat. Her hand aggressively flew up to cover her open mouth. Richard quickly grabbed her arm, pulling aggressively on her designer sleeve, desperately trying to force her back down into her chair. A sudden, deeply terrifying realization was rapidly beginning to dawn on his foolish, entirely bewildered face. This was absolutely not a desperate ex-wife crashing a party. This was a highly coordinated, incredibly expensive display of absolute supremacy. I did not even bother to look in Vivian's direction. She was entirely beneath my notice now. I kept my eyes locked directly on the brightly lit main stage, where Julian was currently standing completely paralyzed behind the transparent acrylic podium. I began to walk forward. My steps were incredibly slow, highly deliberate, and completely silent against the plush carpeting of the grand ballroom. The massive crowd of wealthy investors and elite corporate executives seamlessly parted like the Red Sea, aggressively stepping back and bumping into each other to give me a wide, entirely unobstructed path. They were deeply terrified of the heavily armed security forces, but they were also completely mesmerized by the sheer unapologetic confidence and terrifying authority radiating from my every single movement. I walked directly past the VIP table. Simone leaned aggressively forward, her eyes blazing with extreme, unfiltered jealousy and hatred. She aggressively opened her mouth to hurl another venomous, highly condescending insult directly at me, but she immediately snapped her mouth shut when one of my massive tactical security guards deliberately stepped forward and leveled a cold, terrifying, completely uncompromising glare directly into her eyes. She practically shrank back into her chair, her manicured hand aggressively clutching the massive stolen diamond engagement ring resting heavily on her chest. I gracefully ascended the short carpeted stairs leading directly up to the main stage. Julian was sweating profusely, massive beads of cold perspiration aggressively rolling down his forehead. His highly expensive, custom-tailored velvet tuxedo jacket suddenly looked far too large for his rapidly shrinking, entirely defeated frame. His eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered panic. He aggressively opened his mouth to speak, to loudly demand a logical explanation, to aggressively assert his completely fake, highly fabricated authority in front of his massive audience. But absolutely no words came out of his mouth. His throat was completely dry, completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the terrifying moment. I stepped right into his personal space, bringing with me the faint, highly expensive scent of my custom perfume. I reached out with a perfectly manicured hand and smoothly took the wireless microphone directly from his aggressively trembling fingers. He surrendered the heavy electronic device, instantly, completely overpowered by the absolute dominance of my presence. He was entirely incapable of fighting back. I turned slowly away from my deeply terrified former husband and looked out over the massive, entirely silent sea of wealthy faces. The bright, piercing blue light from the massive Zephyr Holdings logo, projected heavily behind me, cast long, highly dramatic shadows entirely across the grand stage. I slowly raised the wireless microphone directly to my lips, savoring the absolute intoxicating power of the moment I had meticulously planned for weeks. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice completely calm, incredibly steady, and projecting loudly and flawlessly through the freshly reactivated, highly advanced audio system. I sincerely apologize for the highly dramatic, incredibly sudden interruption to your elegant evening festivities. My name is Zarya. For those of you in this room who strictly monitor the global financial markets and deeply analyze major corporate acquisitions, you already know exactly what that massive, brightly lit logo directly behind me represents. But for those of you who simply came here tonight to drink highly expensive vintage champagne, aggressively network with your peers, and celebrate a completely fabricated, highly fraudulent illusion of corporate success, allow me to formally and properly introduce myself to this entire city. I paused for a brief, highly dramatic second, letting the absolute silence of the room stretch to its absolute breaking point. I am the founder, the primary strategic visionary, and the absolute sole owner of Zephyr Holdings. I announced, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute finality. I am the supreme parent corporate entity that successfully and quietly acquired the absolute entirety of Apex Tech exactly 8 months ago. Every single financial asset, Every single vendor contract, every single piece of intellectual property, and every single employee currently standing in this massive building ultimately answers directly and exclusively to me. A massive, highly audible collective gasp aggressively ripped through the deeply crowded ballroom. Hundreds of wealthy investors, senior corporate executives, and elite local politicians frantically whispered to each other, their eyes darting wildly and aggressively between my perfectly calm face and the massive blue corporate logo illuminating the stage. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the massive revelation hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. They were currently standing in the direct, highly commanding presence of an anonymous billionaire titan they had collectively spent months desperately trying to identify and aggressively court for massive financial investments. Directly behind me, the physical reaction was utterly, completely devastating. Julian physically stumbled backward, his highly polished, expensive dress shoes slipping slightly and dangerously against the smooth, polished surface of the stage floor. He aggressively grabbed the sharp edge of the transparent acrylic podium with both hands, just to desperately keep himself from completely collapsing onto the ground in sheer, unfiltered terror. The terrifying, completely undeniable realization hit him like a massive, high-speed commercial freight train. The entire foundation of his highly arrogant, completely fabricated life aggressively shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces in a single fraction of a second. The poor, supposedly uneducated, entirely insignificant charity worker he had aggressively mocked at the steakhouse, severely underestimated for years, and ruthlessly rushed to divorce just a few days ago, was actually his ultimate supreme corporate boss. I was the absolute uncontested commander of the entire billionaire holding company that completely controlled his entire professional destiny. And most terrifyingly of all, as he stared blindly at my perfectly calm, completely ruthless expression, Julian suddenly realized with absolute sickening, entirely paralyzing clarity that as the supreme owner of the entire corporate conglomerate, I possessed completely unrestricted, highly secure administrative access to every single deeply protected internal financial ledger he had just brazenly, aggressively stolen from. He finally understood that I knew absolutely everything. I did not give Julian a single second to breathe, to formulate a pathetic lie, or to desperately beg for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I held the wireless microphone firmly in my left hand and calmly reached into the hidden pocket of my emerald silk gown with my right. I pulled out a small, sleek electronic remote control. I pointed it directly at the audio-visual receiver located at the back of the room and pressed a single glowing red button. The massive blue Zephyr Holdings logo on the high-definition projector screen directly behind me instantly vanished. It was rapidly replaced by a series of highly classified, incredibly damning financial documents magnified to 20 feet tall, making it absolutely impossible for anyone in the elite society of Atlanta to miss a single, highly incriminating detail. The collective gasp from the audience was deafening. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice echoing with terrifying authority over the massive sound system. "Please direct your absolute, undivided attention to the screen behind me. You are currently looking at a completely fraudulent, heavily fabricated vendor contract for $2 million. This highly illegal document was manually authorized and digitally signed by your brand new chief executive officer just 4 days ago." I pressed the button again. The massive screen instantly shifted, displaying the official corporate registration documents from the state of Delaware. "The sole recipient of this massive wire transfer is not a legitimate corporate strategy firm," I continued, my eyes locking directly onto the VIP table. "It is a completely fake shell company called Onyx Consulting, secretly owned and exclusively operated by his deeply unqualified brother-in-law, DeAndre. They aggressively conspired to steal $2 million of corporate capital and funnel it directly into a private offshore account." The wealthy corporate investors in the audience began to shout in pure, unfiltered outrage. These were men and women who aggressively protected their massive financial portfolios. discovering that the newly appointed CEO was actively robbing them blind in his very first week, caused a massive, highly volatile ripple of pure fury to spread rapidly across the ballroom. But I was not completely finished. I pressed the red button one final time. The massive screen shifted to display a highly restricted, heavily encrypted digital wire transfer log. The bright red numbers highlighted the exact, undeniable origin of the stolen funds. But the absolute worst offense, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, uncompromising register that completely silenced the furious crowd. Is this highly specific digital transaction? Julian did not just attempt to steal general corporate capital. He aggressively bypassed massive security protocols to steal exactly $100,000 directly from the Apex Tech Emergency Employee Pension Relief Fund. He actively robbed the protected retirement savings of his own hardworking employees simply to purchase a massive diamond engagement ring for his mistress. I pointed my perfectly manicured finger directly at Simone, who was currently sitting completely frozen in her chair at the VIP table. Every single camera flash, every single furious set of eyes in the massive ballroom instantly snapped directly onto her. Simone physically recoiled, desperately trying to cover her left hand, but the massive diamond ring sparkled aggressively under the ambient light, serving as a highly visible, completely undeniable beacon of their severe federal crimes. Before the furious murmurs of the wealthy crowd could completely escalate into a massive, uncontrollable riot, the heavy metal deadbolts on the main ballroom doors violently snapped open with a deafening crack. The massive brass doors were aggressively kicked wide open from the outside. Federal agents, nobody move. A massive booming voice aggressively commanded over a heavy tactical megaphone. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau Investigation, wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow lettering across their backs, aggressively swarmed into the grand ballroom. They moved with terrifying, absolute military precision, instantly establishing a highly secure perimeter around the massive room. The elite high society of Atlanta completely panicked, aggressively backing away and creating a massive wide-open path directly toward the main stage and the VIP table. A heavily armed tactical squad completely bypassed the terrified crowd and sprinted directly toward the front table. DeAndre realized his entirely fabricated life was completely over. Fueled by sheer, unfiltered panic, he aggressively pushed his chair back and desperately tried to run toward the locked emergency exit. He did not even make it 3 steps. A massive federal agent aggressively tackled him from behind. The sheer, overwhelming force of the heavy impact sent DeAndre violently crashing face first directly onto the VIP table. Expensive crystal champagne flutes, heavy silver platters, and towering floral centerpieces aggressively shattered into a million tiny pieces, showering the polished floor with sharp glass and spilled wine. The agent aggressively pinned DeAndre down against the broken table, forcefully twisting his arms painfully behind his back. The heavy, highly distinctive sound of steel handcuffs, aggressively ratcheting shut, echoed loudly over the chaotic screams of the terrified crowd. Chloe completely lost her mind. She stood up and began screaming hysterically, jumping up and down in pure, unadulterated terror. Her newly purchased designer Birkin bag slipped from her shaking hands, aggressively hitting the floor as she wildly backed away from the violent arrest of her husband. She desperately looked around for someone, anyone, to aggressively demand that the federal agent stop, completely forgetting that her massive wealth was entirely fake and her social status was completely, utterly meaningless. Up on the main stage, Julian was completely paralyzed. He did not try to run. He did not try to fight. He simply stood trembling violently behind the transparent acrylic podium, staring blankly as 2 senior federal agents marched aggressively up the carpeted stairs directly toward him. "Julian!" I said, my voice cutting sharply through the chaotic noise of the massive ballroom. I turned to fully face him, stripping away the very last shred of his pathetic, unearned dignity. "As the supreme owner and chairman of the board for Zephyr Holdings, I am officially terminating your employment at Apex Tech, effective immediately. You are permanently stripped of all executive corporate titles. Your massive stock options are completely and irrevocably revoked. You are leaving this building with absolutely nothing. The two senior federal agents aggressively grabbed Julian by both of his arms. They forcefully spun him around, slamming his chest aggressively against the clear acrylic podium he had planned to deliver his triumphant speech from. They forcefully yanked his wrists behind his back, the heavy steel handcuffs loudly snapping shut over the sleeves of his ridiculously expensive custom-tailored velvet tuxedo. Julian, you are under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, grand larceny, and the severe unauthorized embezzlement of federally protected employee pension funds, the senior agent shouted loudly, his authoritative voice echoing aggressively across the silent watching crowd. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be heavily used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The incredibly harsh, completely undeniable reality of the Miranda rights being loudly read to a chief executive officer in front of the entire corporate elite of Atlanta was a truly historic, deeply humiliating spectacle. Julian hung his head completely in shame, silent tears of pure, unfiltered terror, aggressively rolling down his pale face. The agents aggressively marched him off the stage, parading him directly past the furious, disgusted faces of the wealthy investors he had actively tried to rob. Down at the ruined VIP table, the absolute chaos of the massive federal raid was completely destroying the carefully fabricated illusion of their family. Simone was aggressively backed into a corner by a federal agent screaming loudly that she was a highly respected corporate lawyer and demanding professional immunity, completely ignoring the fact that her career was now entirely over. DeAndre was being aggressively hauled off the floor, his designer suit completely ruined by spilled wine and broken glass. But Vivian, the highly arrogant, intensely demanding matriarch of the toxic family, realized with absolute terrifying clarity that her massive ship was rapidly sinking straight to the bottom of the ocean. The imaginary millions were completely gone. The country club memberships were entirely voided. The federal prison sentences were completely guaranteed. And true to her incredibly selfish, entirely narcissistic nature, she instantly decided to aggressively throw her own flesh and blood directly under the massive bus to desperately save herself. Vivian violently stepped away from Chloe, who was still loudly sobbing on the floor. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger directly at DeAndre as he was being hauled away in heavy steel handcuffs, and then she violently pointed directly at Julian as the agents marched him toward the main doors. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, Vivian screamed frantically, her voice completely devoid of any maternal loyalty or familial love. She aggressively looked around at the federal agents and the disgusted crowd desperately trying to construct a highly sympathetic narrative. I am just an innocent mother. I did not know anything about any stolen corporate money. Julian and DeAndre did this entirely on their own. They aggressively lied to me. I am a highly respected member of this community. You cannot possibly hold me responsible for the terrible illegal actions of grown men. I am a victim here. She was aggressively loudly denying her own son in front of hundreds of people just to desperately avoid federal scrutiny. It was the absolute ultimate display of her deeply rotten, entirely hollow character. I stood perfectly still on the main stage, looking down at Vivian as she desperately tried to distance herself from the massive, completely undeniable catastrophe she had actively helped create. I slowly handed the wireless microphone to the lead executive security director standing beside me. I gracefully walked down the short carpeted stairs of the main stage, my emerald silk gown trailing elegantly behind me. The heavy crowd parted once again, allowing me to walk completely unobstructed directly toward the ruined VIP table. Vivian stopped her hysterical, highly fabricated screaming as I approached her. She looked at me with a desperate, terrified glimmer of false hope in her eyes, genuinely foolishly believing that since she had not directly signed the fraudulent corporate paperwork, she was entirely safe from my massive, unyielding wrath. She had absolutely no idea that I had saved the absolute best, most devastating financial trap exclusively for her. I stopped walking, standing merely 2 feet away from the woman who had aggressively commanded I take $50,000 and disappear from her elite world forever. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, ready to completely dismantle her entire life. Vivian stared up at me, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to project the false image of an innocent, victimized mother. She genuinely thought her loud public denial of her own son would miraculously save her from the massive wreckage. I slowly reached into the small designer clutch I held in my left hand. I did not pull out a handkerchief for her highly theatrical tears. Instead, I pulled out a thick, heavy piece of perfectly folded legal paper. I calmly unfolded the document and held it up so the bright ambient light of the ballroom clearly illuminated the bold black text and the highly distinctive red notary seals. "You boldly claim you had absolutely nothing to do with this massive criminal enterprise, Vivian," I said, my voice projecting loudly and clearly enough for the federal agents and the surrounding elite crowd to hear every single word. "You aggressively demand immunity, claiming you are just a highly respected member of this elite community who was cruelly deceived. But the federal paper trail tells a completely different, highly incriminating story." Vivian looked at the paper in my hand, her eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text. All the remaining color instantly drained from her perfectly made-up face. Her legs visibly trembled and she aggressively gripped the edge of a nearby chair to keep herself from collapsing. "Just 3 days ago, I continued my tone, completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. You and Richard willingly and eagerly signed this exact document. You aggressively remortgaged your massive ancestral home, the absolute only piece of real generational wealth your family actually possessed. You took out a massive, highly predatory loan specifically to provide the initial seed capital for DeAndre's completely fraudulent Delaware shell company. You actively funded the exact criminal vehicle they used to steal $2 million from my corporation. You are not an innocent bystander, Vivian. You are a direct active financial accomplice to a massive federal crime." Richard let out a loud, pathetic groan, physically burying his face in his shaking hands. He knew the absolute truth was finally out. But Vivian, entirely incapable of accepting defeat, desperately tried to pivot her defense. "That is just a standard bank loan," Vivian stammered aggressively, her shrill voice cracking under the massive pressure. "You cannot possibly prove we knew the consulting firm was fake. And even if we did that, mortgage is securely held by our regional bank. You have absolutely no legal right to stand here and aggressively wave my personal financial documents in my face. You do not control my bank." I offered her a cold, terrifyingly sharp smile. "You are absolutely right, Vivian. I do not control your regional bank, because exactly 6 hours after you foolishly signed your name on the dotted line, your bank actively realized your massive loan was highly toxic and entirely secured by fraudulent income projections. They aggressively shopped your debt portfolio on the secondary financial market to liquidate their risk." I took a slow, highly deliberate step closer to her. "And my private equity division at Zephyr Holdings purchased your entire debt portfolio at a premium cash price. I am not just your ultimate corporate boss, Vivian. I am now your direct, exclusive mortgage lender. I literally and legally own the banknote to your sprawling suburban estate." Vivian gasped, physically stumbling backward as if I had just violently struck her across the face. "And because you actively secured that massive loan under highly fraudulent pretenses to explicitly fund a federal criminal enterprise, I am officially calling the entire loan due immediately. I announce delivering the absolute final, devastating blow. You are completely in default. You and Richard have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap, heavily financed belongings you have left and permanently vacate the property. My commercial real estate developers have already determined that your ancestral home is worth vastly more as a vacant lot. If you are not completely off the premises by tomorrow evening, the bulldozers are scheduled to arrive and completely level your precious home to the ground." Vivian let out a piercing, completely hysterical scream. Her knees finally buckled and she collapsed entirely onto the polished ballroom floor, her highly expensive designer gown pooling uselessly around her shaking body. She began to weep uncontrollably, aggressively, pounding her fists against the floor, mourning the absolute permanent loss of her fake royal status. Before I could even turn away from the pathetic sight of Vivian weeping on the floor, a sharp, highly arrogant voice aggressively interrupted the silence. "You cannot possibly do this!" Simone snapped loudly, aggressively, pushing her way past a federal agent to stand directly in front of me. Simone was desperately trying to salvage her rapidly imploding life. She aggressively smoothed down her bright crimson dress, attempting to forcefully project the intimidating aura of a highly successful corporate lawyer. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my face, her stolen diamond ring catching the harsh light. "I am a senior legal partner at Vanguard," and Hayes, Simone declared, aggressively relying entirely on her empty legal jargon. "What you are doing here is a massive, highly actionable abuse of corporate power. You cannot simply unilaterally foreclose on a residential property without a lengthy judicial review, and you certainly cannot authorize federal agents to aggressively arrest an executive officer without a formal corporate hearing. If you do not order these agents to immediately release Julian and DeAndre, I will personally file an aggressive multi-million-dollar civil rights lawsuit against you and Zephyr Holdings by tomorrow morning. I will completely destroy your corporate reputation." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. Simone actually believed her law degree made her completely untouchable. She genuinely thought she could aggressively bully her way out of a massive federal raid. I turned my head slightly and locked eyes with the senior FBI agent standing just a few feet away. I reached out, and one of my elite tactical security directors immediately placed a thick, bright blue legal folder directly into my hand. I calmly held the folder out to the senior federal agent. "Agent," I said, clearly completely ignoring Simone's empty, pathetic threats. "Inside this folder, you will find the complete, highly classified digital metadata extracted directly from the Onyx Consulting Incorporation documents filed in the state of Delaware." Simone's arrogant, highly aggressive posture instantly vanished. Her arms slowly dropped to her side, and a look of pure, unadulterated terror rapidly washed over her face. She knew exactly what digital metadata meant. DeAndre is far too incompetent to legally draft highly complex corporate shell company documents by himself, I explained to the entire room, keeping my eyes locked directly on Simone. The digital fingerprints on those fraudulent documents prove they were explicitly drafted, heavily reviewed, and officially submitted using the secure IP address and the highly encrypted legal credentials of a junior partner at Vanguard and Hayes. I turned my absolute, uncompromising attention back to Simone. "You did not just sleep with a married man in expensive hotel rooms, Simone. You actively utilized your prestigious legal background to explicitly facilitate a massive $2 million federal embezzlement scheme. You are the architect of the shell company." "That is a complete lie," Simone shrieked frantically, her voice reaching a highly unnatural, panicked pitch. She aggressively stepped backward, desperately trying to put distance between herself and the massive federal agents rapidly closing in on her. "Julian lied to me. He completely manipulated me. I had absolutely no idea the consulting firm was a criminal front." "You can try selling that pathetic narrative to the federal judge," I replied coldly. "But you should probably know that Vanguard and Hayes does not take kindly to their prestigious commercial offices being actively used to facilitate federal felonies. Specifically because I officially purchased their entire commercial building 3 days ago, and I am now their direct landlord. I personally forwarded this exact blue folder to the senior managing partners of your firm exactly 1 hour ago. You were officially fired before you even stepped out of your rented limousine tonight." Simone opened her mouth to aggressively argue, but absolutely no sound came out. She was completely, utterly trapped. Furthermore, I continued delivering the final, inescapable reality of her new life. "My corporate legal team has already officially notified the State Bar Association of Georgia regarding your highly documented, undeniable involvement in this massive federal fraud. Your prestigious legal license is currently suspended pending an expedited disbarment hearing. You are no longer a lawyer, Simone. You are officially an active accomplice to grand larceny." The senior FBI agent did not hesitate for a single second. He aggressively stepped forward, grabbing Simone roughly by her bare arm. He swiftly spun her around, forcing her hands behind her back. Simone screamed hysterically, thrashing wildly against the massive agent, completely ruining her perfect hair and smudging her expensive makeup. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted loudly and painfully around her wrists. Another agent quickly stepped forward, firmly gripping her left hand. He aggressively, unapologetically slid the massive $100,000 diamond engagement ring completely off her finger, loudly declaring it officially confiscated as stolen federal evidence. Simone let out a devastating, completely broken wail as the massive stone was dropped carelessly into a clear plastic evidence bag. I stepped back and slowly surveyed the absolute magnificent devastation of the grand ballroom. The entire family was completely, utterly ruined. Julian was standing near the heavy brass doors, tightly handcuffed his entire career and personal freedom permanently destroyed, crying silently as the reality of a decade in federal prison completely crushed him. DeAndre was bleeding slightly from his face, aggressively pinned against the shattered remains of the VIP table. Chloe was sitting in the middle of the floor, loudly wailing over her ruined life and her lost designer bags. Simone was being forcefully dragged away in steel bracelets, her prestigious career and her stolen diamonds entirely gone. And Vivian and Richard were collapsed on the floor, weeping bitterly, completely bankrupt, utterly homeless, and publicly humiliated in front of the exact elite society they had spent their entire pathetic lives aggressively trying to impress. They had absolutely nothing left. I had aggressively, systematically taken every single thing they valued. I turned toward the massive crowd of wealthy investors and corporate executives. They were entirely silent, completely awestruck by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the corporate slaughter they had just witnessed. I walked gracefully over to a nearby untouched catering table. I smoothly picked up a delicate crystal flute filled to the brim with highly expensive chilled vintage champagne. I walked back to the center of the polished floor, standing proudly among the shattered glass and the weeping remnants of my former family. I raised the crystal glass high into the bright ambient light of the ballroom. To the bright, highly profitable future of Apex Tech, I announced, my voice completely steady, echoing with supreme, absolute victory. And to the undeniable reality that true corporate power absolutely never tolerates a thief. I took a slow, highly satisfying sip of the crisp champagne. I lowered the glass, placed it gently onto the edge of the ruined VIP table, right next to Vivian's shaking hand, and turned my back on them completely. I did not look back. I did not need to. I walked smoothly and gracefully toward the massive brass doors of the Grand Hotel. The heavily armed tactical security guards and the federal agents immediately stepped aside, clearing a wide, highly respectful path for me. I walked out of the suffocating, chaotic ballroom and stepped directly out into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night. My armored black Escalade was waiting perfectly at the curb, the heavy door already held open by my private driver. I stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of the vehicle, the door closing with a heavy, highly satisfying thud. As the SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the flashing red and blue lights of the federal raid far behind me, I looked out at the glowing skyline of the city. The massive conflict was finally over. The toxic family was completely destroyed, and my billionaire empire was absolutely permanently secured. The greatest lesson from this story is that true power never needs to be loud. When toxic people mistake your humility for weakness, let them. Their own greed and arrogance will inevitably become the exact trap that destroys them. Never compromise your authentic self to fit into a room where you are not valued. Sometimes walking away in silence is simply the first step before you come back and buy the entire building. Have you ever had to walk away from people who severely underestimated your worth? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please hit the subscribe button for more stories of ultimate resilience and justice.